They beat me. I'm dying." Those 5 words, gasped through blood-stained lips on a rain-soaked Wyoming porch, would shatter the silence of the loneliest man in the territory. Colt Mercer, 7 feet of scar tissue and buried rage, thought he'd closed the door on humanity forever. But when a half-dead woman collapsed at his threshold, fleeing men who'd treated her like property, his choice would ignite a war that forced an entire town to choose between cowardice and courage. Stay until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in low over the Bitterroot Range that October afternoon, clouds the color of old bruises dragging their bellies across the Wyoming plains. Wind howled through the gaps in Colt Mercer's barn, rattling the few tools he kept, sending tumbleweeds skittering across the hardpan like fleeing ghosts. He stood in the doorway of his ranch house, if you could call 4 rough-hewn walls and a stone chimney a house, watching the horizon darken to the shade of gunmetal. Colt Mercer was not a man who feared storms. He'd lived through worse. At 7 feet and 2 inches, with shoulders that filled a doorframe and hands that could palm a horse's skull, Colt was a giant even in a land that bred large men. His face was a roadmap of violence survived, a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jawline, another that carved through his upper lip, and a nose that had been broken so many times it sat slightly crooked. His eyes, pale gray, like winter ice, carried the particular emptiness of a man who'd seen too much and said too little about it. He'd come to this desolate corner of the Wyoming Territory 3 years ago, bought 80 acres of scrubland from a widow who needed cash more than she needed memories, and hadn't spoken more than 50 words to another human being since. The nearest town, Redemption Springs, lay 8 miles east, a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to existence along the North Platte River, where men drank away their failures and women learned to look away from things that would haunt them. Colt didn't go to town. Town came to him only when it absolutely had to, and even then, people kept their distance. They called him the Giant Killer, in whispers, though no one seemed to know what he'd killed or why. Some said he'd murdered a man with his bare hands in a Denver prison yard. Others claimed he'd been a bare-knuckle fighter who'd beaten a man to death in a bout that was supposed to be friendly. A few believed he'd served as an executioner somewhere back east, pulling levers and tightening nooses with those massive hands. The truth was simpler and somehow worse, but Colt had long since stopped correcting people's stories. Let them think what they wanted. Fear kept them away, and away was exactly where he needed them. The rain started as he turned back inside, fat drops that sounded like thrown pebbles against the roof. Within minutes, it became a deluge, one of those plain storms that turned the world into a gray curtain of water. Thunder cracked so close the windows rattled. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the sparse interior of his home. A bed in one corner, a table with 2 chairs, though no one ever sat in the second one, a cast-iron stove, and shelves that held more ammunition than food. Colt was lighting a lamp against the premature darkness when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A knock. He froze, his hand still on the match, listening. For a moment he thought he'd imagined it. Who would be out in this weather? Who would come here of all God-forsaken places? Then it came again, weaker this time. Not quite a knock, more like something falling against the door. Colt moved to the window, pressed himself against the wall, and peered through the rain-streaked glass. At first he saw nothing but the storm. Then lightning flashed, and in that brief moment of illumination, he saw a shape on his porch, small, hunched, wearing what might have once been a dress but was now just tattered fabric clinging to a human form. His first instinct was to ignore it. Whatever trouble had brought someone to his door, he wanted no part of it. Trouble was precisely what he'd come here to escape. But the shape moved, lifting what he realized was a hand, and knocked again. This time, he heard something else beneath the thunder, a voice, thin as wire, breaking on the word. Please. Colt stood still for a long moment, every instinct screaming at him to stay where he was, to let the storm take whatever it had brought, to preserve the isolation he'd worked so hard to build. 3 years. 3 years without complication, without connection, without the terrible weight of carrying what happened to another human soul. The knock came one more time, then stopped. In the silence that followed, Colt heard something that cut through all his carefully constructed defenses. The sound of a body sliding down his door, of someone giving up, of life preparing to surrender to the cold and the rain and the indifferent earth. He was across the room before he'd made a conscious decision to move. The door swung open and the storm screamed into his house, bringing with it the smell of rain and blood and something else, the acrid stench of fear. On his porch, crumpled against the doorframe like a pile of discarded rags, lay a woman. She wasn't old, maybe 30, with dark hair plastered to her skull and skin so pale it seemed translucent in the lamplight spilling from the house. Her dress, and it had been a dress once, a simple calico thing, was torn in places that told a story Colt didn't want to read. Her face was a mess of bruises, one eye swollen completely shut, her lips split and still bleeding. Her bare feet were cut and muddy, and her hands, when she tried to lift them, shook so badly she couldn't complete the gesture. "Please," she whispered again, and it was the sound of a last prayer. "They beat me. I'm dying." Colt stared down at her, this broken thing on his porch, and felt something crack inside the careful walls he'd built around himself. He'd told himself he was done with this, with helping, with caring, with the inevitable pain that came from letting yourself matter to other people or letting them matter to you. But here she was, and here he was, and some choices aren't really choices at all. He bent down, which, given his size, required him to nearly fold himself in half, and scooped her up as gently as his large hands could manage. She weighed almost nothing, like picking up a child or a ghost. Her head lolled against his chest, and he felt the shallow flutter of her heartbeat through her soaked clothing. "Don't die," he said, surprised by the sound of his own voice, rough from disuse but firm. "Not yet." He carried her inside and kicked the door shut against the storm. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness as Colt worked on her injuries, and in those moments of waking she seemed more terrified of him than of whatever had brought her here. She flinched when his shadow fell across her, gasped when his hands came near, and once, when he had to touch her arm to examine a deep cut, she let out a cry that sounded like it had been pulled from somewhere primal. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, keeping his voice low and his movements slow. "You're safe now." She didn't believe him. Her good eye rolled white with fear, but she was too weak to run, and eventually her body's desperate need for care overrode her terror. Colt had some experience with wounds. You didn't survive what he'd survived without learning how to stitch flesh and set bones. He'd tended his own injuries out here more times than he cared to count. Kicked by a horse, gored by a half-wild bull, cut by barbed wire and sharp metal in his own carelessness. His hands, despite their size, could be surprisingly delicate when the situation demanded it. He started with the worst of it, the gash across her forehead that had bled so much it had nearly blinded her. Head wounds always bled like hell, even when they weren't as serious as they looked. He cleaned it with whiskey. She screamed, a sound that cut through him like broken glass, and stitched it closed with the same thread he used to mend his shirts. She passed out before he finished, which was probably a mercy. The other injuries told a story that made Colt's jaw tighten until his teeth ached. Bruises in the shape of fingers around her throat and upper arms. Defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. Her ribs felt wrong on the left side. At least 2 broken, maybe 3. The cuts on her feet suggested she'd run a long distance, probably barefoot, through rough terrain. And there were other signs. Things he didn't examine too closely, evidence of violence that made something cold and familiar coil in his gut. Rage. Old, patient rage that knew how to wait. He stripped off her wet clothes as clinically as he could manage, averting his eyes from anything that wasn't actively injured, and wrapped her in a blanket that was probably older than she was, but at least was clean and dry. Then he carried her to his bed, the only bed in the house, and laid her down with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone who knew his reputation. For himself, he pulled the other chair closer to the stove and settled in to wait. Och. She slept for almost 24 hours, waking only occasionally to moan or cry out or thrash against dreams that were clearly worse than her waking pain. Each time, Colt rose from his chair, stiff from holding still for so long, and checked her pulse, her breathing, the fever that rose and fell like a tide throughout the night. He gave her water when she would take it, spooning it past her cracked lips. He changed the bandage on her forehead twice and checked her ribs, which were wrapped tight now with strips torn from an old sheet. The swelling in her face began to go down slowly, painfully, the bruises shifting through their rainbow of healing, purple to blue to that sickly green-yellow that meant the worst was passing. On the second morning, her eye opened, the one that could open, and focused on him with something resembling clarity for the first time. "Where?" she started, then stopped, her voice raw. "My place," Colt said. He was at the table, drinking coffee that tasted like boiled leather and staring at the wall. "Wyoming Territory, 8 miles west of Redemption Springs." She processed this slowly, her gaze moving around the sparse room, taking in the rough walls, the minimal furnishings, the arsenal of weapons hanging from pegs. Her working eye returned to him, and he saw the fear flicker back to life. "You're safe," he said again, keeping his voice level. "I'm not going to hurt you." "That's what they said," she whispered. Colt had no response to that. He stood up. She tensed as he did, pressing herself back against the wall, and moved to the stove to pour broth from the pot he'd kept simmering. Just bones and water and some dried vegetables. Nothing fancy, but it was warm and it would help. He brought it to her carefully, keeping his movements predictable and slow, and set it on the crate he'd pulled beside the bed to serve as a nightstand. "Can you sit up?" he asked. She tried, gasped at the pain in her ribs, and managed to lever herself up enough to lean against the wall behind the bed. Colt picked up the bowl and held it out, but she couldn't seem to make her hands cooperate. They shook too badly to hold anything. "I can—" He gestured to the bowl, then to her, asking permission. She stared at him for a long moment, this giant of a man with his scarred face and his careful voice, and something shifted in her expression. Not trust, exactly, maybe just exhaustion, or the recognition that if he'd wanted to harm her, he'd had ample opportunity already. She nodded. Colt sat on the edge of the bed, which creaked alarmingly under his weight, and spooned broth into her mouth with the same patience he'd shown with the water. She took small sips at first, then began to drink more eagerly, the warmth of it seeming to wake something in her that had been sleeping. When the bowl was half empty, she turned her head away and he set it aside. "Thank you," she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. Colt nodded. Words had never been his strength, and he wasn't about to start pretending they were now. "What's your name?" she asked after a long silence. "Colt Mercer." "I'm Nora," she said. "Nora Hale." Another silence settled between them, this one heavy with all the questions that hung in the air like smoke. Colt didn't ask them. Whatever she wanted to tell him, she'd tell him when she was ready. Whatever she wanted to keep hidden, that was her business. But Nora, it seemed, was tired of hiding. "They're going to come looking for me," she said, her voice gaining strength. "The men who did this. They'll find me, and when they do—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "How many?" Colt asked. "What?" "How many men?" Nora closed her eye, and he saw her counting in her head. 4 usually, sometimes more. They're part of a wagon crew, settlers heading to the gold fields. I was their cook. Was. They don't pay. They just take. Whatever they want. Whenever they want." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Colt saw her good hand clench in the blanket. 2 nights ago, I fought back. One of them, Ezekiel Boonhart, he's the wagon master. He beat me for it. Said I was property, same as the mules. Said if I ran, he'd track me down and make sure everyone knew what happens to women who don't know their place. But you ran anyway. I waited until they were drunk and sleeping, and then I ran. A ghost of defiance flickered across her battered face. I ran all night, through the brush, through the creeks, through places I couldn't even see. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from them. And you ended up here. I saw your light. I thought, I don't know what I thought. Maybe that anyone would be better than them. Maybe that I'd rather die trying to find help than give them the satisfaction of killing me themselves. She looked at him directly now, her one good eye searching his face. Are you going to send me back? No. The word came out harder than he'd intended, and Nora flinched slightly, but Colt didn't soften it. Some things needed to be said plainly. You're not property, he continued, his voice dropping back to its normal low rumble. You're not going back to them. And if they come here looking for you, they'll have to get through me first. You don't know what you're saying, Nora said, and now there was fear in her voice again, but it was fear for him, not of him. Ezekiel isn't alone. He's got men who'll do whatever he says. They've killed before. I've seen them do it. They shot a man in Nebraska just for arguing over a campsite. They'll come here with guns and let them come. Colt stood up, his head nearly brushing the ceiling beams, and moved to the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glittering with the particular clarity that comes after rain. In the distance, he could see the mountains standing sharp against the sky. "I've been trying to stay out of things," he said, more to himself than to her. "Trying to keep quiet, keep separate, keep safe." He turned back to look at her. "But some things you can't stay out of. Some things find you whether you want them to or not." "I'm sorry," Nora whispered. "I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door." "Door was there," Colt said simply. "You knocked. That's all there is to it." But they both knew it wasn't that simple. They both knew that somewhere out on the plains, men were asking questions, following tracks, moving closer to this isolated ranch house, and the two people inside it who dared to defy them. And they both knew that when those men arrived, the silence that had protected Colt Mercer for 3 years would finally, inevitably, shatter. Over the next 3 days, Nora grew stronger. Not strong. Her ribs would take weeks to heal properly, and the cuts on her feet meant she could barely walk. But stronger than she'd been. Strong enough to sit up without gasping. Strong enough to take over feeding herself. Strong enough to ask questions. "Why do you live out here alone, Must?" she asked on the third afternoon, watching as Colt worked on repairing a bridle that had been damaged in the storm. His hands stilled for a moment, the leather strap hanging loose between his fingers. "Same reason anyone does. Needed distance." "From what?" "People." Nora smiled slightly at that, though it pulled at her healing lip. "That much I figured out, but why? A man like you could be anything, do anything. Marshal, maybe. Foreman on a big ranch. Why hide out here where no one can find you?" "Who says I'm hiding?" "Your eyes say it. The way you move, always checking the windows, always keeping your back to the walls. You're hiding from something." Colt set down the bridle and looked at her directly. "Maybe I'm hiding from myself." "That," Nora said softly, "I understand." They fell into a rhythm, these two broken people sheltering under one inadequate roof. Colt did the heavy work, tending his few cattle, repairing the storm damage to his barn, riding the property line to check for breaks in his fencing. Nora, as she was able, began to help in small ways, stirring the pot on the stove, folding the blankets, organizing the chaos of his shelves into something resembling order. She also cooked, which was something of a revelation to Colt. He'd been living on beans and hardtack and the occasional rabbit for 3 years, cooking over an open fire, or the stove with all the skill of a man who saw food as fuel and nothing more. Nora, despite her injuries, could transform his meager supplies into actual meals. Biscuits that rose instead of sitting in the pan like lead discs, stew that had flavor beyond hot and filling, even coffee that tasted like something other than punishment. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" he asked one evening, watching her work at the stove with surprising efficiency despite her bandaged hands. "My mother," Nora said. "She ran a boarding house in Kansas City. Taught me that good food was a form of dignity, a way of saying, 'You matter,' to people who might not hear it anywhere else." She smiled sadly. "After she died, I took work where I could find it, cooking for ranch hands, for railroad crews, for wagon trains heading west. It was honest work, mostly, until it wasn't." "Boonhart's crew." "Yeah." She turned the biscuits carefully, her face tight with concentration. "They seemed decent at first. A family group, they said, settlers heading to try their luck in the gold fields. They promised fair wages and safe travel. But once we were 3 days out, far enough that I couldn't turn back alone. That's when things changed." "How long were you with them?" 4 months. She said it flatly, without emotion, but Colt heard everything underneath those 2 words. 4 months of fear, of violation, of slowly losing herself piece by piece. "I kept thinking someone would help, that we'd pass another wagon train or meet travelers or reach a town where I could find a marshal or someone who'd care. But Ezekiel, he's careful. He keeps to the empty places, and when we do pass other people, he makes sure I know what'll happen if I say anything." "He threatened you." "He showed me." Nora's voice dropped. There was a girl traveling with us, younger than me, maybe 18. She complained about how the men looked at her, asked me if I thought we should leave at the next town. I said yes. Ezekiel overheard. She closed her eyes. They left her in the middle of the prairie, just rode off while she was gathering water at a creek. I looked back and saw her running after us, screaming. We kept riding. Colt felt his jaw clench. You tried to help her. I tried to tell Ezekiel she'd die out there alone. He just smiled and said, then she'll learn not to complain. Nora's hand shook as she lifted the pan from the stove. That's when I knew. If I stayed, that was going to be me. One day, he'd decide I wasn't useful anymore, or I'd push back one time too many, and they'd just leave me. Or worse. So you ran. So I ran. She set the biscuits on the table, 6 perfect golden rounds that smelled like everything warm and safe in the world, and knocked on the door of a complete stranger and asked him to die for me. I'm not going to die, Colt said. Nora looked at him across the table, this giant man with his scarred face and his careful hands, and something in her expression was older than her years. Everyone dies, Colt. The only question is what you die for. On the 4th day, a rider appeared on the horizon. Colt saw him first. He'd been watching the east like a man waiting for a storm, and immediately moved to the window with his rifle. The rider was still a mile out, moving slowly, like someone who wasn't in any particular hurry but knew exactly where he was going. Nora, Colt said quietly, get away from the windows. She didn't argue. She moved to the corner of the room, pressing herself against the wall in the shadows, her face pale. The rider came closer, resolving into a single man on a paint horse, wearing a duster and a hat that had seen better days. As he approached the house, he raised one hand in a gesture that was either greeting or surrender, and called out, Colt Mercer, you in there? Colt didn't answer, just kept his rifle trained on the man's center mass. Name's Jacob Cross, the rider continued, stopping his horse about 30 yards from the porch. I'm from Redemption Springs. Got word you might have company? Wanted to come check on the situation before it gets out of hand. Who sent you? Colt called back. The marshal. Dutch Vernon. You know him? Colt did know him, a decent man as lawmen went, but hamstrung by a town that didn't particularly want law. What does Vernon want? He wants to know if you're harboring a runaway cook named Nora Hale. Because if you are, there's 4 very angry men in town asking questions and making threats, and Dutch would like to resolve this before someone gets killed. In the corner, Nora made a small sound of fear. Tell Vernon she's under my protection, Colt said. Whatever those men are claiming, they're liars. I believe you, Jacob said, and he sounded like he meant it. But Boonhart's claiming she's a thief, says she stole money and supplies when she ran. He's got papers, too, some kind of contract that says she owes him labor in exchange for passage west. Says by law she's obligated to return with him. That's bullshit, Nora whispered, but Colt heard her. The contract's a fake, Colt called out. She's not going back. Jacob nodded slowly. That's what I figured you'd say. And between you and me, I believe you, but Colt, these men, they're not the type to give up easy. Boonhart's got the whole town stirred up, saying you're kidnapping women now, saying you're the one who hurt her. People are scared. They're talking about riding out here, making sure you haven't... He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Haven't what? Haven't done what they've heard you can do. What they've heard you did before. There it was. The past, catching up. Colt had known it would eventually. The past always did. But he'd hoped for more time. I didn't hurt her, he said clearly, and I'm not giving her back to the men who did. If Vernon wants to come out here and verify that, he's welcome. But he comes alone. I'll tell him. Jacob started to turn his horse, then stopped. Colt? Those stories people tell about you, are they true? Colt looked at the man, this stranger who'd ridden 8 miles to deliver a warning that he didn't have to deliver, and decided on honesty. Some of them. Jacob absorbed this, then nodded once. Then maybe Boonhart and his boys should think twice before they come calling. He touched his hat in farewell. Good luck, Colt. You're going to need it. He rode off, leaving dust and dread in his wake. Colt waited until the rider disappeared over the ridge, then lowered his rifle and turned to Nora. She'd slid down the wall and was sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly. He's here, she whispered. He's in town. He found me. He hasn't found you yet, Colt said. And when he does, he's going to wish he hadn't. You don't understand. Nora looked up at him, and her face was haunted. Ezekiel doesn't lose. He doesn't give up. He'll burn this place down with both of us in it before he lets me go. And he'll make everyone believe it was justified. Colt crossed the room and knelt beside her, a movement that took him from towering to merely large, and spoke with quiet conviction. Then we make sure they know the truth first. We make sure the whole town knows what he did to you, what he is. We take away his story before he can tell it. How? We go to town, together. You tell Vernon everything, and we make damn sure there are witnesses. Nora stared at him like he'd lost his mind. I can't go to town. Look at me. I can barely walk. And even if I could, what's to stop Ezekiel from just taking me the second we arrive? Me, Colt said simply. I'm what stops him. 1 man against 4, 5? However many he's got with him? 1 man who's got nothing left to lose. Colt stood up, offering her his hand. And 1 woman who's done running. That's more than enough. Nora looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted between them. She'd been surviving for 4 months, running for days, hiding since she'd arrived. But survival wasn't living, and hiding wasn't freedom. She took his hand and he pulled her to her feet with the same careful strength he'd shown from the beginning. They stood facing each other in the dim interior of the ranch house, 2 people who'd found each other by accident and decided, despite everything, to stand together. All right, Nora said, her voice steady for the first time since she'd collapsed on his porch. Let's go tell the truth. And if Ezekiel Boonhart wants to call me a liar, let him do it to my face. Colt allowed himself the smallest of smiles. That's the spirit. Outside, the Wyoming sun burned down on the plains, and somewhere to the east, in a town called Redemption Springs, men were making plans and telling lies and sharpening the knives they'd use to carve up the truth. But here, in this isolated house where silence had reigned for 3 years, 2 people were preparing to make some noise. And noise, Colt Mercer had learned long ago, was the sound of change arriving whether you wanted it or not. The ride to Redemption Springs took 2 hours, and every minute of it felt like tempting fate. Colt had hitched his single horse, a rangy buckskin gelding named Rust, to a wagon he hadn't used in over a year, the wheels protesting with rusty squeals as they lurched into motion. Nora sat beside him on the bench seat, wrapped in a coat 3 sizes too large for her, her battered face partially hidden by a scarf he'd found in a trunk. Not to hide the evidence, but to protect her from the wind that cut across the plains like a blade. She hadn't spoken much as they'd prepared to leave, just watched him load his rifle, check his pistol, and strap a knife to his belt with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew exactly how violence worked. When he'd helped her up onto the wagon, lifting her like she weighed nothing, she'd gripped his arm and asked one question. Have you killed people before? Colt had looked at her directly, his pale eyes unreadable. Yes. Will you kill for me? If I have to. She'd nodded, as if that settled something in her mind, and they'd set off without another word. Now, as the wagon rattled along the rutted track that passed for a road, Colt kept his attention split between the horizon ahead and the woman beside him. Nora sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, her breathing shallow. Every time the wagon hit a bump, which was often, she winced as her broken ribs protested. But she didn't complain, didn't ask to turn back, didn't show any sign of the terror he knew must be eating at her from the inside. Tell me about Redemption Springs, she said suddenly, her voice tight. What kind of town is it? Colt considered the question. The kind that got its name because someone thought it sounded hopeful. Mostly it's ranchers and drifters, some miners passing through on their way to the fields, a few families trying to build something that'll last. It's not good, and it's not bad. It just is. And the marshal? Vernon? Can we trust him? More than most, Colt admitted. Dutch Vernon's been wearing the badge for about 5 years. He's fair when he can be, but he's also practical. If Boonhart's got the town convinced I'm the villain here, Dutch won't stake his career on defending me. Then why are we going? Because the truth matters, Colt said. And because if we don't get ahead of this story, Boonhart writes it for us. Nora was quiet for a moment, then said softly, Back at your place, that rider, Jacob, he asked if the stories about you were true. What stories? Colt's hands tightened on the reins. He'd known this question would come eventually. Stories about what I did before I came here. Which was? Things I'm not proud of. He glanced at her. Does it matter? I suppose that depends on what the things were. Colt guided the wagon around a washout in the road, giving himself time to choose his words. I was a fighter, bare knuckle, back alley, the kind where men bet on who'd stay standing and who'd get carried out. Did it for 8 years, from the time I was 17 until I was 25. Made good money, too, enough that people started to take notice. What kind of people? The bad kind. Men who wanted to own something valuable, and I was valuable. Good at hurting people, good at taking damage, good at not asking questions about why we were fighting or what happened to the losers. His voice had gone flat, reciting facts like they belonged to someone else. Eventually, I fought in a bout that was supposed to be fixed. I was supposed to go down in the 3rd round, let the other man win, make some rich bastards a lot of money. But you didn't go down. No. Colt's jaw tightened. The other fighter, his name was Thomas Brennan, and he had a wife and 2 kids. He came at me like a man who had nothing to lose. Found out later his family had been threatened, told if he didn't win, they'd kill his daughter. So he fought like hell, and I fought back because that's what I did. I didn't know about his family. Nobody told me. Nora's hand moved slightly toward him, then stopped. What happened? I hit him too hard. Wrong angle, wrong moment, wrong everything. He went down and didn't get up. Died 3 days later without ever waking up. Colt's voice cracked slightly on the last word, then hardened again. The men who'd bet against me, they weren't happy. Tried to kill me that night in my room. I killed 2 of them instead. Hurt 3 more badly enough that they won't ever be the same. Then I ran. And came here. And came here, Colt confirmed. Thought if I stayed away from people, stayed away from fighting, stayed away from everything that made me into what I was, maybe I could, I don't know, stop being that person. But did it work? Colt looked at her then, really looked at her. This woman who'd survived 4 months of hell and still had the strength to ask difficult questions. I don't know yet. Ask me again after today. The town appeared on the horizon like a fever dream, wavering in the heat that rose from the plains despite the autumn chill. False-fronted buildings lined a single main street, their paint faded and peeling, their signs creaking in the wind. Redemption Springs wasn't much to look at, but it was civilization such as it was, and as they drew closer, Colt could see people stopping in the street to watch their approach. They're staring, Nora whispered. They're always staring when I come to town, Colt said. Just keep your head up. You've got nothing to be ashamed of. But as they rolled down Main Street, past the general store, the saloon, the feed and grain, Colt realized the attention was different this time. People weren't just watching, they were clustering together, whispering, pointing. A woman pulled her children inside. A man stepped off the boardwalk and disappeared into an alley. The few who held their ground did so with hands near their pistols, eyes tracking Colt's every movement. The marshal's office sat at the far end of the street, a squat building with bars on the windows and a sign that read Town Marshal, in letters that had once been gold but were now just flecks of paint. Colt pulled the wagon to a stop in front of it and set the brake with more force than necessary. Ready? He asked Nora. She nodded, though her face had gone the color of old paper. Colt climbed down first, then moved around to help Nora. She tried to manage on her own, but her feet couldn't take her weight yet, and she stumbled. Colt caught her, steadying her with a hand on her elbow, and together they moved toward the marshal's office, like 2 people walking toward a gallows. The door opened before they reached it. Dutch Vernon stood in the doorway, a man in his 50s with iron-gray hair and a face that had been weathered by sun and disappointment. He wore his badge pinned to a vest that had seen better days, and his hand rested casually on the pistol at his hip. Not threatening exactly, but not welcoming either. Colt, he said by way of greeting. His eyes moved to Nora, and something shifted in his expression, surprise maybe, or recognition of exactly how badly she'd been hurt. Ma'am. Marshal, Colt replied. We need to talk. I'd say so. Vernon stepped aside, gesturing them in. Though I should tell you, you've got company waiting. Colt's hand moved toward his pistol. What kind of company? The kind that got here first, Vernon said grimly. Boonhart and two of his men. They've been in my office for the past hour, telling me all about how you kidnapped their cook and beat her half to death. Now here you are with her, and I'm going to need to hear your side before this gets any uglier. We'll tell you everything, Nora said, her voice stronger than Colt expected. But Marshall, whatever they told you, it's a lie. Vernon's eyes softened slightly as he looked at her. Ma'am, I've been wearing this badge long enough to know that truth usually lives somewhere between the stories people tell, but I also know what a beating looks like, and you've taken one hell of one. So let's all step inside, keep things civil, and figure out what actually happened. They followed him into the office, and Colt immediately assessed the room the way he'd learned to assess any space that might become a battlefield. 2 cells in the back, both empty. A desk cluttered with papers and a coffee pot that smelled like it had been burning for days. 3 men standing near the far wall, and the moment Colt saw them, he knew exactly what kind of men they were. The one in the center had to be Ezekiel Boonhart. He was tall, not as tall as Colt, but few men were, with a lean, ropey build and a face that might have been handsome if it weren't for the cruelty in his eyes. He wore a black duster and a hat with a silver band, and his boots were polished to a shine that suggested vanity or obsession or both. When he saw Nora, his mouth curved into a smile that made Colt's trigger finger itch. Well, Boonhart said, his voice smooth as oil. There she is, Nora, darling. We've been so worried about you. Nora made a sound like a wounded animal and pressed herself against Colt's side. The 2 men flanking Boonhart were cut from cheaper cloth, hired muscle with mean eyes and the kind of casual violence that came from too many bar fights and not enough consequences. One was stocky with a scar across his nose, the other was younger, maybe 20, with the nervous energy of someone trying to prove himself. Both had pistols on their hips and expressions that said they'd enjoy using them. Marshall, Boonhart continued, his attention shifting to Vernon, I appreciate you bringing her in. This gentleman, he nodded toward Colt with exaggerated courtesy, has been keeping her against her will. I'm sure it was all a misunderstanding, but we'll take her off his hands now and be on our way. Nobody's taking her anywhere, Colt said, his voice low and dangerous. Boonhart's smile didn't waver. I'm afraid that's not your decision, friend. Nora's under contract to my crew. She owes us labor and recompense for the supplies she stole when she ran. That's a legal matter, not a personal one. Show me the contract, Vernon said, holding out his hand. Boonhart produced a folded paper from his coat and handed it over with a flourish. Vernon unfolded it, read it quickly, then read it again more slowly. His expression gave nothing away. This says she agreed to work for 6 months in exchange for passage west and wages to be paid upon arrival in California, Vernon said. It's signed with her name. That's not my signature, Nora said immediately. I never signed anything. Ezekiel, tell him the truth. Now, Nora, Boonhart said, his tone dripping with false sympathy, I know you're upset, but lying won't help. You signed that contract the day you joined our crew, and you knew the terms. If you were unhappy with the arrangement, you should have come to me. Instead, you stole $50 from my lockbox and ran off in the middle of the night. That's theft, Marshall. Plain and simple. That's bullshit, Colt said flatly. Boonhart's eyes narrowed. I don't believe we've been introduced. Colt Mercer, and you're a liar and a coward who beats women when they can't fight back. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The 2 men with Boonhart shifted their weight, hands drifting toward their guns. Vernon stepped between them and Colt, raising both hands. Everyone calm down, he said firmly. Colt, I know you're protective of the lady, but that's a serious accusation. Boonhart, if you've got proof she stole from you, I'll need more than your word. And both of you need to remember that I'm the law here, not you. Of course, Marshal, Boonhart said smoothly. I wouldn't dream of suggesting otherwise. As for proof, I have 3 witnesses who saw Nora with the lockbox the night she disappeared. My men here, he gestured to his companions, and my other associate, Pike, who's waiting at our camp. Your witnesses are the men who hurt her, Colt said. That's not evidence, that's a conspiracy. Then let's hear from Nora herself, Vernon said, turning to her. Ma'am, I need you to tell me what happened. All of it, from the beginning, and I need the truth. Nora took a shaky breath. and Colt felt her gather herself the way someone might gather courage to jump off a cliff. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. "I answered an advertisement in Kansas City 6 months ago," she began. "It said a wagon crew needed a cook for a journey to California. Fair wages, safe travel, respectable people. I was desperate. My money was running out, and I had nowhere else to go. So I met with Ezekiel at a boarding house, and he seemed kind. Said he was leading a group of families west, that they needed someone who could keep everyone fed through the journey. He offered me $20 a month plus meals and protection. I said yes." "And the contract?" Vernon asked. "There was paperwork, but it wasn't what he showed you just now. It was a simple agreement. I'd cook, he'd pay, and we'd part ways when we reached California. That's all." Boonhart scoffed. "She's lying, Marshall. The contract I showed you is the one she signed. If she claims otherwise, she's either mistaken or deliberately deceiving you." "I'm not finished," Nora said, her voice rising. "Everything was fine for the first few weeks. The families were kind, the work was hard but honest. But then, one by one, the families started leaving the crew. They'd have arguments with Ezekiel, or they'd change their minds about California, or they'd just disappear in the middle of the night. Within 2 months, it was just me, Ezekiel, and 4 of his hired men. No families, no other women, just us." "And that's when things changed," Vernon prompted gently. Nora nodded, and Colt saw tears forming in her good eye. "They stopped treating me like a cook and started treating me like I was part of the supplies, like I belonged to them. At first, it was just looks, comments, hands that lingered too long when they took their plates. But then it got worse. Ezekiel said I needed to be friendlier if I wanted to keep eating. Said the men were working hard and deserved some comfort. When I refused, he—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "Take your time," Vernon said. "He hit me," Nora finished. "Not where it would show much, not at first. Bruises I could hide under my clothes. And he made sure I understood that if I complained, if I tried to leave, it would get worse. He showed me what happened to the last woman who'd defied him, found her dress torn up and thrown in the fire, said she'd learned her lesson the hard way." "This is slander," Boonhart interjected, but his voice had lost some of its smoothness. "Marshall, I won't stand here and listen to these accusations. This woman is clearly disturbed." "Shut up," Colt said, and there was something in his tone that made even Boonhart pause. "Let her finish." Nora pressed on, the words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "It went on for months. All of them, Ezekiel, Pike, Reed, Jacob, they'd take turns. Sometimes separately, sometimes together. I tried to fight back at first, but there were always more of them than me, and they were stronger. So I learned to go somewhere else in my head while it happened. I learned to survive." Vernon's face had gone gray. "Why didn't you run sooner?" "Where would I go? We were in the middle of nowhere most of the time. Prairie, mountains, places without towns or people. And Ezekiel made sure I knew what would happen if I tried. He told me about the girl before me, the one whose dress he burned. Said she'd tried to run and they'd caught her, and by the time they were done with her, she'd begged them to leave her behind. Said death was better than staying with them." Nora's voice broke. 2 nights ago, Ezekiel came to my tent drunk and angry about something. When I tried to push him away, he beat me. Not hidden bruises this time. He beat me in front of the others, beat me until I couldn't see straight, beat me because he could. And when he was done, he said, "This is what happens when you forget your place." The room was silent except for Nora's ragged breathing. Even Boonhart's men looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight and avoiding eye contact. "So I waited," Nora continued. "I waited until they were all asleep, drunk on whiskey and their own cruelty. And I ran, barefoot, because my shoes were in Ezekiel's wagon and I couldn't risk waking him. I ran through the dark, through brush that cut my feet and creeks that soaked me to the bone. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, and then I saw a light in the distance. Colt's light. I knocked on his door and he saved my life." Vernon looked at her for a long moment, then at Boonhart, then at Colt. "That's quite a story, ma'am." "It's the truth," Nora said. "It's fantasy," Boonhart countered, but there was an edge to his voice now. "Marshall, this woman is clearly traumatized, but not by us. Look at the man she's standing next to. Everyone in this territory knows about Colt Mercer, the killer, the fighter, the man who murdered 2 people in Denver and disappeared. She shows up at his door, and days later she's covered in bruises and telling wild stories about respectable men? It's obvious what happened here. Is it? Vernon asked. Of course. Mercer beat her, probably tried to force himself on her, and now she's too terrified to tell the truth. Stockholm Syndrome, I believe they call it. She's protecting her abuser. Colt took a step forward, and both of Boonhart's men drew their pistols. Vernon moved quickly, putting himself between them. Nobody's drawing weapons in my office, he said sharply. Holster those guns right now, or I'll arrest all of you for disturbing the peace. The men hesitated, looking to Boonhart for guidance. He nodded, and they reluctantly holstered their pistols. Marshal, Boonhart said, his voice taking on a reasonable tone, I understand this is complicated, but the facts are simple. Nora was under contract. She broke that contract and stole from me. Whether she was abused or not, and I maintain she was not, she still committed a crime. I'm willing to forgive the theft if she returns with us peacefully. We'll even pay for a doctor to see to her injuries. All I want is my cook back and my property restored. She's not property, Colt said. The law says she is, Boonhart replied. That contract binds her to service until the debt is paid. It's perfectly legal, Marshal. You know that. Vernon rubbed his face tiredly. Contract labor is legal, yes, but so is the right to be free from harm. If what Nora says is true, it is, Colt interrupted, then that contract is void, and these men should be arrested for assault and worse. Vernon looked at Boonhart. The problem is, it's her word against yours. I've got no witnesses except the people in this room, all of whom have a stake in the outcome. I can't make an arrest based on accusations alone. So what are you saying? Nora asked, her voice trembling. That I have to go back with them? I'm saying I need time to investigate, Vernon said. To talk to people, verify stories, maybe ride out to your camp and see if there's any evidence to support either version of events. Until then, nobody's taking anyone anywhere. That's unacceptable, Boonhart said. That's my decision, Vernon shot back. You don't like it. You can file a complaint with the territorial authorities, but in my town, we do things proper. Boonhart's jaw clenched, and for a moment, Colt saw the mask slip, saw the rage and the calculation beneath the smooth exterior. Then the wagon master smiled that oil-slick smile again. Very well, Marshal. We'll wait for your investigation, but I expect it to be thorough and fair. My men and I will be staying at the hotel across the street. When you're ready to hear sense, you know where to find us. He tipped his hat to Nora with exaggerated courtesy. Until then, darling, try not to let that brute intimidate you into any more lies. He left, his men following, and the tension in the room finally broke. Vernon sank into his chair and gestured for Colt and Nora to sit. Well, that was about as pleasant as a rattlesnake in a sleeping bag. What happens now? Colt asked. Now, I do my job. I'll ride out to their camp tomorrow, look around, see if there's anything that supports Nora's story. I'll also talk to some of the folks in town who might have seen Boonhart and his crew come through. If I find evidence of wrongdoing, I'll arrest them. If I don't, he trailed off, letting the implication hang. If you don't, they take her, Colt finished. Not if she doesn't want to go, but legally, if that contract's valid, I can't stop them from pursuing damages. The contract's a forgery, Nora insisted. Maybe so, but proving that'll take time, and Boonhart doesn't strike me as a patient man. Vernon leaned forward. My advice? You two stay in town tonight. Get a room at the other hotel, not the one where Boonhart's staying. Keep a low profile. Let me do my job. And Colt? Yeah? Don't do anything stupid. I know your reputation, and I know what you're capable of. But if you go after Boonhart, you'll be the one in jail, not him. Understand? Colt understood. He just wasn't sure he cared. They left the marshal's office as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains. The street was busier now, people emerging from wherever they'd hidden when Colt arrived. But the stares remained, and so did the whispers. Where are we going? Nora asked quietly. To get you a room and some food, Colt said. Then I need to make sure no one follows us. The hotel, the Pioneer Rest, was a 2-story building with a veranda and windows that looked out on Main Street. The proprietor, a thin woman with suspicious eyes, took Colt's money without comment and handed over a key to a second-floor room. King. As they climbed the stairs, Nora leaning heavily on Colt's arm, he scanned every shadow, every doorway, every possible angle of attack. The room was small but clean, a bed, a chair, a washstand with a chipped basin. Nora sank onto the bed with a sigh that spoke of exhaustion deeper than physical pain. "You should rest," Colt said. "I'll be downstairs." "You're leaving?" Fear flashed across her face. "Just to the lobby. I won't let them get to you." "Colt." She reached out, caught his hand. "Thank you. For believing me. For all of this." He looked down at her hand in his, so small, so damaged, and felt that crack inside him widen a little more. "Get some sleep, Nora. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." But as he closed the door behind him and took up position in the lobby where he could watch both the stairs and the street, Colt knew that tomorrow might not give them any answers. It might only bring more questions, more violence, more proof that some men were willing to burn the world down rather than admit they were wrong. Through the window, he could see the hotel across the street where Boonhart was staying. Could imagine the man up there, planning, scheming, preparing to take back what he believed he owned. Let him try, Colt thought. Let him try and see what happens when you corner something that's got nothing left to lose. The sun set, and darkness came to Redemption Springs like a judgment waiting to be delivered. Night settled over Redemption Springs like a held breath, the kind of silence that feels more dangerous than noise. Colt sat in the hotel lobby with his back to the wall and his eyes on the street, watching shadows move across the windows of the building where Boonhart had taken rooms. The clerk behind the desk, a nervous man named Peterson who kept glancing at Colt like he expected violence to erupt at any moment, had long since given up trying to make conversation. Now he just sat there shuffling papers and pretending not to notice the giant with the scars who hadn't moved in 3 hours. Around midnight, Colt heard footsteps on the stairs behind him. Light, careful footsteps that tried not to make sound. His hand went to his pistol before he registered that the gate was wrong for a threat. Too hesitant, too pained. He turned to see Nora descending slowly, one hand on the railing, her face pale in the lamplight. "You should be sleeping," he said, rising from his chair. "I tried." She reached the bottom of the stairs and moved toward him, wrapping the oversized coat more tightly around herself. "Every time I close my eyes, I see them coming through the door. Hear Ezekiel's voice, feel his hands." She stopped a few feet away, her good eyes searching his face. "How do you do it? Sit here so calm, so still, when you know they're right across the street planning God knows what." "I'm not calm," Colt admitted. "I'm just good at waiting, had a lot of practice." Nora glanced at the clerk, who was doing an admirable job of pretending to be invisible, then back at Colt. "Can we talk? Somewhere more private?" He hesitated, then nodded toward the front door. "Veranda. I can still see the street from there." They stepped outside into air that had turned cold, autumn asserting itself against the lingering heat of day. The wooden boards of the veranda creaked under Colt's weight as he positioned himself at the railing, angled so he could watch both the hotel across the street and the woman beside him. Nora stood close enough that he could feel the tremor running through her, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "I keep thinking about what Ezekiel said in the marshal's office," she said quietly. "About you, the things you've done. He called you a killer." "I am a killer," Colt said flatly. "That part's true. But the rest? About you hurting me? About Stockholm Syndrome and all that?" She turned to face him fully. "Why didn't you defend yourself? Why didn't you tell Vernon the truth about what happened?" "What good would it have done? Boonhart's already planted that seed. People hear what they want to hear, believe what they're predisposed to believe. Giant ex-fighter who killed 2 men finds a beaten woman and suddenly she's defending him? Easiest thing in the world to spin that into something ugly. So you just let them think you're a monster?" Colt's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I don't have to let them think anything. They decided what I was the moment I came to this territory. Nothing I say is going to change that." Nora was quiet for a moment, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "I don't think you're a monster," she finally said. "You don't know me. I know you saved my life. I know you could have turned me away, could have ignored my knocking, could have decided I was too much trouble. But you didn't. And I know that when Ezekiel tried to intimidate you today, you stood between him and me without hesitation. That's not what monsters do. Monsters protect things too, Colt said, just for different reasons. Then what are your reasons? The question hung in the cold air between them, and Colt found himself without an easy answer. Why had he opened the door that storm-soaked night? Why had he taken on the responsibility of another person's survival when he'd spent 3 years avoiding exactly that kind of entanglement? Why was he standing here now, preparing to fight a battle that wasn't his against men who would just as soon kill him as look at him? Because you knocked, he finally said, and because I know what it's like to be something people use and throw away when they're done, and because... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Because what? Because maybe I'm tired of being alone with what I've done. Maybe I thought if I could help you, it would balance the scales somehow. Make me less of the thing everyone thinks I am. Nora reached out and did something that shocked them both. She took his hand. Her fingers were cold and small against his scarred knuckles, but her grip was firm. You don't have to balance anything, she said. You don't owe the universe some kind of payment for your past. You just have to be better than you were. And Colt, you're already better than most men I've known. He looked down at their joined hands, this connection that felt both fragile and impossibly strong, and something shifted in his chest. For 3 years he'd avoided touch, avoided closeness, avoided anything that might remind him he was human and capable of feeling. But here was this woman who had every reason to fear men and their hands, reaching out to him anyway, offering something he'd forgotten he needed. Thank you, he said quietly. They stood like that for a long moment, two damaged people finding something like comfort in each other's presence. Then Nora shivered, and Colt reluctantly released her hand. You need to get back inside, he said. It's too cold out here. Will you come up? Just to sit in the chair while I try to sleep? I don't want to be alone right now. Every instinct told Colt this was a bad idea. Being alone in a room with her, giving the gossips more ammunition, compromising the fragile protection of propriety. But the fear in her eye overrode all of it. All right, he said. But I'm staying by the door. They went back inside, past the clerk who watched them with knowing eyes that made Colt's jaw tighten, and up the stairs to Nora's room. True to his word, Colt positioned the chair so his back was to the wall, and he could see both the door and the window. Nora climbed into bed fully clothed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Colt? She said into the darkness. Yeah? If they come tonight, if Ezekiel decides not to wait for the marshal's investigation, will you really fight them? Yes. Even if it means killing them? If that's what it takes. She was quiet for a moment. I don't want you to die for me. Then I'll make sure I don't. Another silence, longer this time. When Nora spoke again, her voice was drowsy, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. My mother used to say that everyone gets one moment in their life where they have to choose between who they were and who they're going to be. She said most people choose wrong, choose the easy thing, the safe thing, the thing that doesn't cost them anything. But the ones who choose right, who choose the hard path, even when it would be easier to walk away, those are the ones who matter. Sounds like a wise woman. She was. I wish she could have met you. I think she would have liked you. I doubt that. I don't. Nora's breathing was evening out, sleep claiming her. You're a good man, Colt Mercer. I don't care what anyone else says. You're good, and you matter, and I'm glad I knocked on your door. Colt didn't respond, couldn't respond past the tightness in his throat. He just sat there in the darkness, listening to her breathing slow and deepen, and tried to remember the last time someone had called him good. Tried to remember what it felt like to be seen as something other than a weapon or a monster or a cautionary tale. He couldn't remember. Maybe no one ever had. The hours crept past. Outside, the town slept uneasily, windows dark, streets empty except for the occasional dog or drunk stumbling home. Across the street, the hotel where Boonhart stayed showed a single lit window on the second floor. Someone awake, someone watching, someone planning. Colt marked its position, memorized the sight lines, calculated how long it would take someone to cross the street and reach this building. Around 3 a.m, he saw movement. A figure emerged from Boonhart's hotel, looked both ways, then hurried down the street toward the marshal's office. Too dark to identify clearly, but the build was right for one of Boonhart's men, the stocky one with the scar. Colt watched him disappear around the corner, then reappear 10 minutes later and slip back into the hotel. What were they doing? Trying to bribe Vernon? Threatening him? Or something else entirely? Colt shifted in his chair, his muscles protesting the long stillness. On the bed, Nora murmured something in her sleep. A name, maybe, or a plea, and curled tighter under the blankets. Even in sleep, she couldn't escape what had been done to her. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the window and painting everything in shades of exhaustion. Colt heard the town beginning to wake, doors opening, horses being led to water, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Normal sounds of a normal day, except nothing about this day would be normal. Nora woke as the sun cleared the horizon, sitting up with a gasp that suggested her dreams had been no kinder than her reality. She looked around wildly until her eye found Colt still in his chair, and something in her face relaxed. "You stayed," she said. "Said I would." "Did anything happen?" Colt told her about the midnight visitor to the marshal's office. Nora's face paled. "They're trying to turn him against us," she said. "Ezekiel's good at that, finding what people want or fear and using it to get his way. If he can convince Vernon that I'm lying, that you're dangerous, then we need to move first," Colt finished. He stood, working the stiffness out of his shoulders. "Get dressed. We're going to find Vernon before he has time to act on whatever Boonhart's man told him last night." But when they made their way downstairs and out into the morning chill, they found the marshal already coming toward them, his face grim. Behind him walked two men Colt didn't recognize, deputized civilians from the look of them, wearing hastily pinned badges and carrying rifles like they weren't quite sure how to use them. "Colt," Vernon called out as they approached. "Hold up a minute." Every muscle in Colt's body tensed. "What's this about, Dutch?" Vernon stopped a dozen feet away, close enough to talk but far enough to draw his pistol if needed. The deputies spread out slightly, and Colt registered their positions, calculated angles and timing, and how quickly he could disarm them if this went bad. "We need to have a conversation," Vernon said, official-like, "about what happened at Boonhart's camp." "You went there already?" "Left before dawn. Wanted to see the place before Boonhart had time to clean up any evidence." Vernon's expression was unreadable. "Found some interesting things, such as a lockbox with a broken lock and about $45 inside, 5 short of what Boonhart claimed was stolen. Such as bloodstains in one of the tents that matched the description of where Nora said she slept. Such as another tent full of women's clothing, dresses, undergarments, shoes, that Boonhart claims belonged to previous cooks who left them behind. Lot of previous cooks for a man who's only been running wagon crews for 2 years. Hope flared in Nora's eye. "Then you believe me?" "I believe something bad happened at that camp," Vernon said carefully. "Question is whether it happened the way you said, or the way Boonhart's now claiming." "What's he saying?" Colt asked, though he already knew the answer would be bad. "He's saying you and Nora are working together, that she stole the money, got caught, and you helped her escape because you've got some kind of arrangement. He's also saying that one of his men, fellow named Pike, went missing last night. Found his body this morning about a mile outside town, shot twice in the back. Boonhart's claiming you killed him to keep him from testifying against Nora." The words hit like a physical blow. Colt heard Nora gasp beside him, felt the world tilt sideways as the trap Boonhart had been building snapped shut around them. "That's insane," Nora said. "Colt was with me all night. He never left my room." "That's what you'd say if you were protecting him," Vernon pointed out. "And ma'am, I don't mean to be indelicate, but a woman alone in a room all night with a man? That's the kind of thing that makes your story less believable, not more." "So that's it?" Colt's voice was dangerously quiet. "Boonhart murders his own man, blames me, and you're going to arrest me on his word?" "I'm going to hold you for questioning while I sort this mess out," Vernon corrected. "Big difference. You come peacefully, we'll get it straightened out. You make trouble, and I'll have no choice but to assume Boonhart's right about you." "And what about Nora?" "She stays in town, under protection, until I can verify her story. If she's telling the truth, she's safe. If she's not," Vernon shrugged, "then we'll deal with that too." Colt looked at Nora, saw the terror and guilt warring on her face, saw her about to protest or confess to something she didn't do just to protect him. He shook his head slightly, a message that said, "Trust me, let me handle this." "All right," he said to Vernon. "I'll come. But Dutch? You'd better figure out the truth quick, because if Boonhart gets anywhere near her while I'm locked up, there won't be enough left of him to bury." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." Vernon sighed like a man who'd known this job would be hard, but not quite this hard. "Come on then. Let's get you settled in a cell before this day gets any worse." As they walked toward the marshal's office, Colt in front, the deputies flanking him with nervous trigger fingers, he heard Nora call out, "Colt, I'll fix this. I'll tell them everything. I'll—" "Stay in the hotel," he called back without turning. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but Vernon." Then they turned a corner and she was gone from his sight, alone in a hostile town, with nothing but his reputation to protect her. And that reputation, Colt knew, was more likely to get her killed than keep her safe. The cell was exactly what he'd expected: iron bars, a thin mattress, a bucket in the corner. Vernon locked the door with an apologetic expression that didn't make Colt feel any better about the situation. "I know you didn't kill Pike," Vernon said quietly once the deputies had left. "Timing doesn't work, and you're not stupid enough to shoot a man in the back and leave the body where it'll be found. But Boonhart's got half the town convinced you're a dangerous murderer, and the other half's just waiting for an excuse to form a lynch mob. I hold you here. I can control the situation. You're out there, and I guarantee someone's going to try to be a hero." "How long?" Colt asked. 24 hours, maybe 48. Long enough to prove Pike's death had nothing to do with you, and hopefully long enough to find something that'll stick to Boonhart." Vernon hesitated. "Colt, I want you to know I've been asking around about you. The stories about Denver, about the men you killed. I got the real version from a retired marshal who worked that case. I know you were defending yourself. I know they came after you first. For what it's worth, I don't think you're the monster people say you are. Doesn't matter what you think if I'm in here and Boonhart's out there. I've got men watching the hotel. Nora will be safe." "Your men are farmers with rifles," Colt said. "Boonhart's men are killers. If they decide to move, your deputies won't stop them." "Then pray they don't decide to move," Vernon said, and walked away, leaving Colt alone with the iron bars and the slow crawl of time. The morning stretched into afternoon. Colt paced the cell like a caged animal, 6 steps one way, 6 steps back, his mind racing through scenarios and contingencies. Every sound from outside made him freeze, listening for screams or gunshots or any indication that his worst fears were coming true. But the town remained quiet, unnaturally so, as if everyone was holding their breath waiting for the storm to break. Around 2 o'clock, Vernon returned with food: bread, cheese, coffee that was barely warm. He slid the plate through the slot in the bars and leaned against the opposite wall. "Boonhart's making noise about leaving town," he said. "Claims he's done his civic duty reporting Pike's murder, and now he needs to get his crew moving before they lose too much time. Says if I don't return his property, meaning Nora, by sundown, he'll take the matter to the territorial authorities." "Let him leave," Colt said. "Better for everyone if he just disappears. He's not leaving without Nora. Made that crystal clear. Said he'll file charges in every town between here and California if necessary, but he's not letting her get away with theft and conspiracy to murder." Vernon rubbed his face tiredly. "And legally, Colt, he might have a case. That contract could hold up, and if it does, Nora's obligated to fulfill its terms." "The contract's a forgery." "Maybe, but I'd need a handwriting expert to prove it, and the nearest one's in Denver. That's a week's travel each way, and Boonhart's not going to wait that long." Colt's hands clenched around the bars. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm out of options here. I've got no evidence that'll stick, no witnesses willing to testify against Boonhart, and a dead man who was conveniently shot when you had opportunity and motive. Best I can do is keep you here and keep Nora safe until either Boonhart leaves or I find something concrete." "That's not good enough. It's all I've got." Vernon pushed off the wall, preparing to leave. "I'm sorry, Colt. I really am, but sometimes the law can only do so much." He left, and Colt sank onto the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. trying not to imagine Boonhart forcing his way into Nora's room or bribing Vernon's deputies to look the other way, or simply waiting until dark to do what men like him always did when they thought no one was watching. The afternoon faded into evening. Through the barred window, Colt watched the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that looked like fire, like war, like blood. Then, just as the last light was dying, he heard it. A commotion in the street, shouts, and the sound of breaking glass. Vernon burst into the office from the back room, grabbing his rifle, his face tight with tension. "Stay here," he ordered Colt unnecessarily, then ran out into the growing darkness. Colt moved to the window, pressed his face against the bars, and saw chaos unfolding. A crowd had gathered in front of the Pioneer Rest. Angry men with torches and weapons, and at their center, directing them like a conductor leading an orchestra, stood Ezekiel Boonhart. "She's a thief and a liar," Boonhart's voice carried clearly in the evening air. "She stole from honest men, conspired to murder one of our own, and now she's hiding behind a killer's reputation. Is that the kind of justice we want in Redemption Springs? Is that the kind of town we are?" The crowd roared its agreement, whipped into righteous fury by Boonhart's words and probably his money. Colt saw Vernon trying to push through the mob, trying to restore order, but he was one man against dozens. The deputies were nowhere to be seen, either scared off or paid off, or simply unwilling to face down their neighbors. And then Colt saw her. Nora appeared in the second-floor window of the hotel, her face pale and terrified, one hand pressed against the glass. She was trapped up there with a mob below and no way out, and even from this distance, Colt could see her looking around, searching desperately for someone to help her, searching for him. Something broke inside Colt then, the last chain holding back 3 years of suppressed violence and rage. He tried to do this the right way, tried to let the law handle it, tried to be better than the thing he'd been. But the law was failing, justice was failing, and the woman who trusted him was about to pay the price for his restraint. No more. He grabbed the bars of his cell and pulled with every ounce of strength in his massive frame. The stone cracked. On the 8th, a chunk broke free, and Colt could see the wooden beam behind it. On the 12th, the beam splintered, and suddenly the bars were loose in their mountings. One more hit, and the entire barred window frame tore free from the wall in a shower of stone dust and ancient mortar. Colt squeezed through the opening, barely, his shoulders scraping raw against the jagged edges, and dropped into the alley behind the marshal's office. He hit the ground running, his mind clear and cold and focused on a single objective. Get to Nora before Boonhart's mob did something that couldn't be undone. The crowd in front of the Pioneer Rest had grown larger, and someone had started throwing stones at Nora's window. The glass shattered, and Colt heard her scream, a sound that cut through everything else and made his vision narrow to a single point of rage. He came around the corner of the marshal's office like a force of nature, and the crowd saw him and parted without conscious thought. Even in their torch-fueled fury, some instinct warned them that what was coming toward them was more dangerous than anything they'd ever faced. Boonhart saw him too. His eyes widened, then narrowed, and he raised his pistol with smooth confidence. "Stop right there, Mercer," he called out. "This doesn't concern you anymore. The lady's coming with me and you're going back to your cell. Otherwise, I'll put you down like the mad dog you are." Colt didn't slow, didn't hesitate, didn't show any sign he'd even heard the threat. He just kept walking forward with terrible purpose, and something in his approach made even Boonhart's confidence waver. "I'm warning you," Boonhart said, his voice rising. Colt was 10 feet away when Boonhart fired. The shot was rushed, panicked, and it went wide, sparking off the dirt to Colt's left. Boonhart tried to aim again, but Colt was already moving, closing the distance with frightening speed for a man his size. His hand shot out and clamped around Boonhart's wrist, squeezing until bones ground together and the pistol dropped to the ground. Boonhart screamed, tried to pull away, but he might as well have been trying to escape from iron shackles. "You made a mistake," Colt said quietly, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "You came to my territory. You threatened someone under my protection. And now you're going to learn what happens when you push a peaceful man too far." He released Boonhart's wrist and backhanded him across the face with enough force to spin the man completely around. Boonhart stumbled, caught himself, and came up with a knife in his other hand, a wicked blade that gleamed in the torchlight. "You want her?" Boonhart snarled, his smooth mask finally cracking completely. You want that used-up whore? Fine. But you'll have to kill me to get her, and I don't think you've got the stomach for murder anymore. I think you're all talk, all reputation, nothing but— Colt hit him again, this time with a closed fist that connected with Boonhart's jaw and dropped him like a puppet with cut strings. The knife clattered away harmlessly. The crowd had gone completely silent now, watching this display of controlled violence with something approaching awe. Behind Colt, Vernon came pushing through with his rifle raised, but he stopped when he saw the situation, saw Boonhart unconscious on the ground, saw Colt standing over him like an avenging angel, saw the mob losing its nerve. It's over, Colt announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the street. This man is a liar, a coward, and a rapist. He hurt an innocent woman, murdered his own man to frame me, and tried to turn you all into his accomplices. Anyone who still wants to help him, anyone who thinks dragging a beaten woman out of her room and handing her over to her abuser is justice, step forward now. Let's settle this. No one moved. The righteous fury that Boonhart had stoked in them was evaporating, replaced by shame and uncertainty. These were decent people mostly, who'd been manipulated by a silver tongue and mob mentality. Faced with the reality of what they'd almost done, they wanted no part of it. That's what I thought, Colt said. He turned to Vernon. I broke out of your cell. That's on me, and I'll answer for it. But first, I'm going to make sure Nora's safe. We clear? Vernon looked at him for a long moment, then slowly lowered his rifle. We're clear. But Colt, I'm going to need you to help me sort out this mess, starting with what really happened to Pike. I can do that, said a new voice. Everyone turned to see a young man stepping forward from the crowd, the nervous one who'd been with Boonhart in the marshal's office, the one Colt had pegged as trying to prove himself. He looked terrified but determined, his hands shaking as he addressed Vernon. My name's Thomas Reed, he said. I rode with Boonhart's crew, and I need to tell you what really happened to Pike, to Nora, to all of it, because I can't live with myself if I don't. Vernon gestured him forward. Start talking. Reed glanced at Boonhart's unconscious form, as if afraid the man would wake up and strike him down, then began to speak. The story he told was even worse than what Nora had described. Months of systematic abuse, multiple women who'd been used and abandoned, threats and violence, and a complete disregard for anything resembling human decency. He described how Pike had started to develop a conscience, had told Boonhart he wanted out, wanted to turn themselves in, and how Boonhart had shot him that very night, then carefully positioned the body and the evidence to frame Colt. He said it was perfect, Reed finished, his voice breaking. Said the giant would hang for it, and we'd get Nora back, and everything would go back to normal. But I couldn't watch him hurt another woman. I couldn't let an innocent man die for something we did. So I'm telling you now, Marshal, arrest me, hang me, whatever you need to do. But please, please don't let him take her. The silence that followed was profound. Even Boonhart's remaining men, the stocky one with the scar, looked sick, as if hearing it all laid out in plain words had broken through whatever justifications they'd been using. Vernon's face had gone hard as granite. Jacob, he called to one of his deputies who'd finally reappeared, get some rope. We're arresting Ezekiel Boonhart for murder, assault, rape, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of once I get him in a cell. Reed, you're under arrest too, but I'll make sure the territorial judge knows you cooperated. The rest of Boonhart's crew, you've got 1 hour to get out of my town. If I see you after that, I'll assume you're complicit and treat you accordingly. The scarred man didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Colt didn't wait to watch the arrests happen. He turned and walked into the Pioneer Rest, taking the stairs 2 at a time despite the exhaustion pulling at him. Nora's door was locked from the inside, and when he knocked, he heard her terrified voice call out, "Who is it? It's me. It's over." The lock clicked, and the door swung open to reveal Nora standing there with a broken chair leg in her hands, her makeshift weapon against a mob. When she saw it was really him, really over, the chair leg dropped from nerveless fingers and she collapsed against his chest, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. Colt wrapped his arms around her carefully, mindful of her injuries, and let her cry. Let her release 4 months of terror and pain and helplessness into the fabric of his shirt. Let her be small and broken and human, because God knew she'd been forced to be strong for far too long. "I thought they were going to take me," she whispered against his chest. "I thought you couldn't get to me, thought I'd have to go back to him, thought—" "Shh," Colt murmured. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you anymore. No one can. You came for me." "Of course I did. You broke out of jail." "That too." She laughed, a wet, broken sound that was still somehow the most beautiful thing Colt had heard in years. "You're going to be in so much trouble. Worth it." They stood like that for a long time, two people who'd found each other in darkness and somehow managed to pull each other toward the light. Outside, Colt could hear Vernon organizing the arrests, the crowd dispersing, the normal sounds of order being restored. But in this room, in this moment, there was only them and the quiet realization that they'd survived something that should have destroyed them. "What happens now?" Nora finally asked, pulling back enough to look up at him. "Now." Colt smiled slightly. "Now you decide who you want to be. Because Nora, you're free, really free. Boonhart's going to prison, or worse, and that contract's worthless even if it was real. You can go anywhere, do anything, be anyone you want. The whole world just opened up for you." "And you?" she asked. "What about you?" "Me?" He shrugged. "I'll probably spend a few days in Vernon's cell for breaking out, pay a fine, then go back to my ranch and my isolation and my quiet life." "That sounds lonely." "It's what I'm used to." Nora reached up and touched his scarred face with gentle fingers. "What if you didn't have to be lonely anymore? What if I stayed?" Colt's breath caught. "Stayed where?" "With you. At your ranch. I'm a good cook, and you clearly need one. And maybe we could help each other figure out how to be something other than what our pasts made us." She smiled tentatively. "If you'd have me, that is." Colt looked down at this woman who'd knocked on his door in a storm and changed everything, who'd trusted him when she had no reason to, who'd stood with him against impossible odds and come out the other side still believing in something better. And he realized that the isolation he'd sought for 3 years wasn't peace. It was just another kind of prison. "I'd have you," he said quietly. "I'd be honored to have you." The smile that broke across Nora's battered face was like sunrise after a long night, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Colt Mercer felt something that might have been hope. The next 3 weeks unfolded like a slow exhale after years of holding breath. Colt spent 2 days in Vernon's cell as promised, not as a prisoner exactly, but as penance for the damaged wall and the chaos of his escape. The marshal seemed almost apologetic about it, bringing him decent meals and updates on Boonhart's situation. The wagon master had been transferred to the territorial prison in Laramie, awaiting trial for murder and a list of charges so long it took Vernon 15 minutes just to read them all. Thomas Reed had been held as a material witness, but would likely face reduced charges for his cooperation. The scarred man and the others had vanished like smoke, probably headed to California or Mexico, or anywhere that wasn't within 1,000 miles of Wyoming Territory. Nora visited Colt both days, sitting on the other side of the bars and talking to him about everything and nothing. About her childhood in Kansas City, her mother's boarding house, the dreams she'd once had of opening a restaurant where people could come not just for food, but for community. About the years after her mother died, drifting from job to job, watching those dreams shrink until they were small enough to fit in a wagon cook's tent. About how strange it felt to suddenly have them expanding again, growing larger and more possible than they'd been in years. Colt told her things too, stories he'd never shared with anyone. About growing up in Philadelphia with a father who drank and a mother who died too young. About learning to use his size and his fists because that was the only currency that mattered on the streets where he'd been raised. About the strange, sick thrill of discovering he was good at violence, that people would pay to watch him hurt others, that he could make more money in one fight than his father made in a month of honest labor. About the moment he'd stood over Thomas Brennan's body and realized he'd become exactly the kind of man he'd once feared. "But you left," Nora said. "You could have stayed in that world, kept fighting, kept making money. Instead, you walked away." "Ran away," Colt corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you made a choice. You saw what you were becoming and decided to be something else. That takes more courage than any fight ever could. Maybe she was right. Colt wasn't sure anymore. The lines between running and choosing, between cowardice and wisdom, had blurred somewhere along the way. All he knew was that sitting here talking to her through iron bars felt more real, more honest than anything he'd experienced in years. When Vernon finally released him on the third day, the town had changed its attitude. Not dramatically. People still gave him space, still watched him with wary eyes. But the naked fear had been replaced by something closer to respect. He'd stood up to a bully, protected an innocent woman, and faced down a mob without killing anyone who didn't desperately need killing. That counted for something in a territory where strength was often the only law that mattered. They left Redemption Springs on a crisp October morning, the wagon loaded with supplies Nora had purchased using money the town's women had collected for her, a gesture of apology for the mob, for not believing her sooner, for all the ways they'd failed to see what was happening right in front of them. It wasn't enough to make up for everything, but it was something. A start. The ride back to Colt's ranch felt different than the ride to town had been, lighter somehow, despite the memories still fresh in both their minds. They talked more easily now, the desperate intensity of crisis replaced by something steadier. Nora pointed out landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a bend in the creek, memorizing the route like she was learning the way home, which, Colt supposed, she was. When the ranch house came into view, small and rough against the vastness of the plains, Nora let out a long breath. "It's not much," Colt said, suddenly self-conscious about the crude building, the weathered barn, the fence that needed mending in a dozen places. "It's perfect," Nora replied. And the way she said it, he almost believed her. The first week was an adjustment for both of them. Colt had lived alone for so long that having another person in his space felt like learning to breathe a new way. He'd catch himself starting to do things the solitary way, eating standing up over the stove, going days without speaking aloud, keeping the kind of silence that was its own form of communication with no one but himself. But Nora would be there, humming while she worked, asking him questions about the cattle or the land or his plans for the coming winter, and slowly he'd remember how to be human around another human. For her part, Nora was rebuilding herself piece by piece. The physical injuries healed faster than the other kind. Her ribs mended, the cuts on her feet scarred over, the bruises faded from purple to yellow to nothing. But there were nights when she woke screaming, nights when she couldn't bear to be touched, nights when she sat on the porch wrapped in blankets and stared at nothing while tears ran silently down her face. Colt learned to recognize the signs, learned when to stay close and when to give her space, learned that healing wasn't a straight line, but a messy spiral that circled back on itself before finally moving forward. They'd agreed she would take the bed and he would sleep in the barn, propriety be damned but practicality observed. But on the fourth night, when her nightmares had been particularly vicious, she appeared in the barn doorway wrapped in a blanket and asked in a small voice if she could sleep near him. Not with him, just near him, because the darkness of the house alone was too much like the darkness of Boonhart's camp. "Of course," Colt had said, and cleared a space in the hay beside where he'd been sleeping. They lay there like siblings or soldiers, close enough for comfort, but careful not to cross any lines that couldn't be uncrossed, and Nora slept through until morning for the first time since the ordeal had ended. It became their routine. Days spent working, Colt on the ranch repairs and cattle, Nora cooking and cleaning and gradually taking over the garden plot she'd discovered behind the house, overgrown but salvageable. Evenings spent on the porch, talking or sitting in companionable silence. Nights in the barn, two broken people finding peace in proximity. "Tell me about the fight," Nora said one evening, about 10 days into their new arrangement. They were sitting on the porch watching the sun set, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink that looked almost artificial in their beauty. "The one where Thomas Brennan died. You said you hit him wrong, but what does that mean?" Colt was quiet for so long she probably thought he wouldn't answer. But something about the evening, about the way she'd asked without judgment, made him want to try. "In fighting, there's a difference between hurting someone and destroying them," he began slowly. "A good fighter knows that difference, knows how to gauge force and angle and impact to put a man down without putting him out." "I was a good fighter, one of the best."
So what happened? I got angry. Colt's hands clenched on his knees. The men who'd arranged the fight, who'd bet on me to lose, they sent someone to my room the night before.
Threatened my sister, said if I didn't throw the fight, they'd find her in Philadelphia and make her pay for my disobedience. I didn't even know they knew about her. Hadn't seen her in 5 years, but they'd found her anyway. Did you throw the fight? No, because halfway through I realized the whole thing was a setup. Brennan was fighting like a man possessed, taking hits that should have dropped him and getting back up. Found out later they'd threatened his daughter, so we were both out there trying to lose and trying to win at the same time, both scared of what would happen to the people we loved if we made the wrong choice. Nora reached over and took his hand. He didn't pull away. In the third round, Brennan came at me wild, telegraphing a right hook that any fighter worth his salt would have seen coming. I could have dodged it, could have let it land, could have done 100 things that would have ended differently. But I saw red, saw the men who'd threatened my sister, saw every person who'd ever treated me like a trained animal instead of a human being, and I hit him with everything I had. Not to win, not even to hurt him exactly. I hit him to make a point, to show them all that I wasn't their puppet, wasn't their property, wasn't someone they could control through fear. And he died. 3 days later, without ever waking up. Internal bleeding, the doctor said. My fist had compressed his skull just enough to rupture something vital. If I'd hit him an inch to the left or with 10% less force, he'd have woken up with a concussion and a reminder to choose better employers. But I didn't. I hit him exactly wrong, in exactly the way my training had taught me never to do, because I was angry and scared and sick of being owned by bad men. The sun had nearly disappeared now, just a sliver of gold on the horizon. In the growing darkness, Colt felt rather than saw Nora processing his words.
"Do you dream about him?" she asked finally. "Every night for 3 years. Less now, though, since you came." "Why less?" Colt thought about that. "Because I think I'm finally starting to forgive myself. Not for killing him. I'll carry that forever. But for being human enough to make mistakes, to let anger override judgment, to be something other than the perfectly controlled machine they wanted me to be. Brennan died because 2 evil men decided their gambling debts were more important than human lives. I was the weapon, but I wasn't the hand that aimed it." "That's a very convenient way of avoiding responsibility," Nora said, but her tone was gentle, not accusing. "I know. That's why I'm not all the way to forgiveness yet. Maybe never will be. But I'm trying, and that's more than I was doing when I came here." "Well," Nora said, squeezing his hand, "for what it's worth, I'm glad you're trying. And I'm glad I knocked on the door of a man who still believes in trying." They sat like that until full dark, hands linked, watching the stars emerge one by one, like promises or possibilities or tiny lights showing the way home. The second week brought their first real conflict, which was probably inevitable. Colt came back from checking the fence line to find Nora had rearranged his entire kitchen, such as it was, putting things in what she claimed was logical order, but which meant he couldn't find anything without asking her. His annoyance must have shown on his face, because she immediately got defensive. "I was just trying to help," she said, her voice tight. "Make things more efficient. I liked them how they were." "You liked chaos? You had coffee next to lamp oil, Colt. That's not organization, that's an accident waiting to happen." "It's my chaos, my accident waiting to happen." "Well, now it's our chaos, and I'd like to not die in a kitchen fire, thank you very much." They glared at each other for a moment, and then Colt saw the fear underneath her anger, fear that she'd overstepped, that he was going to send her away, that the fragile peace they'd built was about to shatter. And he saw himself through her eyes, a giant of a man looming over a woman who'd spent months being brutalized by men who thought they owned her, getting angry over the placement of coffee tins. He sat down heavily at the table and gestured to the other chair. "I'm sorry, you're right. It needed organizing. I don't know how to share space with someone. Don't know how to have my things become our things. Been on my own too long." Nora sat slowly, like she was approaching a spooked horse. "I'm sorry too, I should have asked before moving everything. I just got into the work and forgot this isn't my house." "It is your house," Colt said firmly. "That's what we agreed. You live here, you get a say in how things are arranged. I just need time to adjust." "How much time?" "I don't know. How much time do you need before you can go a whole day without flinching when I move too fast?" The honesty of the question seemed to surprise her. I don't know either, but I'm willing to figure it out if you are. Deal, Colt said, and held out his massive hand. Nora shook it, her small hand disappearing into his, and they both started laughing at the absurdity of it all. Two damaged people shaking on a promise to be patient with each other's damage. After that, things got easier. They developed rhythms and routines, learned each other's boundaries and preferences, figured out how to exist in the same space without constantly colliding. Nora started teaching Colt to cook beyond his basic survival skills, showing him how to make bread that didn't require a hammer to eat and stew that had actual flavor. Colt taught her about the ranch, how to read weather patterns, how to spot a sick cow, how to mend fence in a way that would last through winter.
They worked side by side like partners, and slowly the ranch started to look less like a hermit's hideout and more like a home. The town came to them in the third week, which neither of them had expected. Marshal Vernon rode out with Jacob Cross, the man who'd first warned Colt about Boonhart's arrival, and a handful of others, men and women both, carrying baskets and boxes, and expressions that ranged from apologetic to curious. "Heard you two were settling in out here," Vernon said, dismounting near the porch where Colt had been repairing a broken step. "Thought we'd come see how you were managing." Colt stood slowly, defensive instincts rising. "We're managing fine." "I'm sure you are. But Nora's one of us now. Town took up a collection. Means we've got a stake in making sure she's all right. And you—" Vernon smiled slightly. "Well, you're the man who faced down an angry mob for her. That earns you some consideration too, whether you want it or not." Nora had come out of the house at the sound of horses, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw the gathering, her expression cycled through surprise, wariness, and something that might have been hope. "We brought some things," said one of the women, stepping forward. She was older, maybe 50, with kind eyes and gray hair tucked under a bonnet. "Nothing fancy, just some preserves and fabric and a few other items we thought you might could use. Also wanted to apologize proper-like for what happened in town, for not believing you sooner, for letting that man poison us against you." "You don't need to apologize," Nora said quietly. "We do, though. We do. And we want you to know you're welcome in Redemption Springs any time. Both of you." The woman glanced at Colt. "I'm Martha Hensley, by the way. Run the boarding house. Would be honored if you'd come to dinner sometime, both of you." Over the next hour, the visitors unpacked their offerings. Jars of jam and pickles, cuts of fabric, a new set of dishes to replace Colt's battered tin plates, seeds for next spring's planting. They asked questions about the ranch and offered help with larger projects. The men talked to Colt about cattle prices and winter preparations, treating him like a neighbor rather than a threat. The women drew Nora into conversations about recipes and sewing patterns, including her in their community without making a show of it. It was overwhelming and awkward and surprisingly touching all at once. These were people trying to make amends, trying to build bridges, trying to show that they were better than their worst moment. And slowly, carefully, Colt and Nora let them. By the time the visitors left, the sun was setting and the porch was laden with gifts. Nora stood beside Colt, waving as the wagons and horses disappeared over the ridge. And when they were finally alone again, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. "They came for us," she said wonderingly. "Not to judge or threaten or take. They just came for us." "They did," Colt agreed, still somewhat stunned by it all. "I haven't had that in so long. People who just wanted to be kind, who didn't want anything in return. I'd forgotten what it felt like." "Me too." They went inside and made dinner from the food the town had brought, Martha's preserves on fresh bread, vegetables from someone's garden, a pie that was still warm. They ate at the table by lamplight, and for the first time since Nora had arrived, the future felt less like a threat and more like something that might actually be worth building toward. That night, as they settled into their usual spots in the barn, Nora said, "I've been thinking about opening that cookhouse." Colt rolled onto his side to look at her. "Yeah?" "Not in town. At least not at first. But here, maybe. You've got the land. We could build a small structure, nothing fancy. I could cook for ranch hands during roundup season. Maybe take in travelers heading west who need a decent meal. Start small and see what happens." "It's a good idea," Colt said. "But Nora, you don't need my permission. This is your home too. If you want to build something, we'll build it." She smiled in the darkness. I was hoping you'd say we. Where else would I be? I don't know. I keep waiting for you to tell me this was temporary, that once I was healed and Boonhart was dealt with, you'd want your solitude back.
Do you want to leave? God, no. But I don't want to be a burden either. Colt sat up, his bulk shifting in the hay. Nora, look at me. She did, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through the barn slats. You're not a burden.
You're the best thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember. Maybe ever. You make me want to be better than I was, do better than I did. You make this place feel less like a hiding spot and more like a home. So no, I don't want my solitude back. I want this. I want us. However that looks, whatever that means. All right? Her smile could have lit the whole barn. All right. But Colt? Yeah? I want it too, the U.S. part, just so we're clear. We're clear. They lay back down, closer than they usually did, close enough that Colt could feel the warmth of her beside him, close enough that when she reached out in the dark and found his hand, the connection felt like the most natural thing in the world. The fourth week brought the first snow, early even for Wyoming, a light dusting that transformed the plains into something ethereal and beautiful. Colt woke to find Nora standing in the barn doorway, wrapped in a blanket, watching the snowfall with an expression of pure wonder. I haven't seen snow in years, she said when she noticed he was awake. Forgot how quiet it makes everything. He came to stand beside her, and they watched together as the sun rose and set the snow crystals sparkling like scattered diamonds. It was one of those perfect moments that felt almost too fragile to exist. No words needed, no explanations required, just two people sharing the simple beauty of a winter morning. Want to help me check on the cattle? Colt asked eventually. Make sure they're handling the cold all right? I'd like that. They bundled up and headed out into the white landscape, their breath-forming clouds in the crisp air. The cattle were fine, huddled together for warmth, but otherwise unbothered by the early snow. Colt and Nora walked the property line, and Nora peppered him with questions about winter ranching, about what needed to be done to prepare for the harder cold that was coming, about everything and nothing. On the way back, they passed the spot where Nora wanted to build her cookhouse. It was just an empty patch of ground now, unremarkable except for its proximity to the main house and the creek. But Nora stopped and stood there, clearly seeing something that wasn't visible yet. It'll be small, she said, gesturing to invisible walls. Just one room at first. A good stove, a long table where people can sit together. Maybe some shelves for preserves and dry goods. In the spring, I could plant herbs right outside the door. Rosemary, thyme, sage. Things that make food taste like care instead of just fuel. We could start clearing the site after the snow melts, Colt offered. Get lumber from town, maybe hire one of the carpenters to help with the frame. You'd do that? Spend money on my dream? It's not just your dream anymore, it's our dream. Besides, ranchers need to eat too, and I'm tired of my own cooking. Nora laughed, that free, unguarded sound that Colt was learning to cherish. Your cooking's not that bad, just that good. Exactly. So we build you a proper kitchen, and I'll provide the customers. Fair trade. More than fair, Nora said, and impulsively hugged him, the first time she'd initiated physical contact beyond hand-holding. Colt froze for a moment, afraid of doing something wrong, then carefully wrapped his arms around her and held her like she was made of glass and steel all at once. They stood like that in the snow, two people who'd been broken by the world, and were slowly, carefully, teaching each other how to be whole again. It wasn't perfect, nothing about their situation was perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that was more than either of them had thought they'd ever have. That evening, over dinner, Nora brought up something she'd clearly been thinking about for a while. When the trial happens, Boonhart's trial, they're going to want me to testify. Probably, Colt agreed. I'm not sure I can do it. Stand up in front of everyone and tell them what happened. Describe the things he did, the things they all did. Have them look at me and judge whether I'm telling the truth or just a hysterical woman making accusations. You don't have to testify if you don't want to. Reed's testimony alone should be enough to convict him. But what if it's not? What if Boonhart gets some smooth-talking lawyer who convinces a jury that Reed was lying, that I'm lying, that it was all some misunderstanding? What if he walks free? Colt reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Then we deal with it, together. But Nora, you've already survived the worst thing he could do to you. You've already taken back your life, your voice, your power. Whether you testify or not doesn't change that. You don't owe anyone your trauma. Not the court, not the town, not even justice itself. You only owe yourself peace. What if I want to testify? Not because I have to, but because I want him to hear me say it. Want him to know that I survived, that I'm not broken, that he didn't win. Then I'll be right there with you, in the courtroom holding your hand, reminding you that you're stronger than whatever he can throw at you. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. Nora nodded slowly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you for always making it a choice, for never pushing me one way or another, for just being there. Where else would I be? It became their phrase, their touchstone. Where else would I be? Colt would say it when Nora woke from nightmares. Nora would say it when Colt got that distant look that meant he was back in Denver, standing over Brennan's body. Where else would I be? It meant commitment and presence and the simple, profound truth that they'd chosen each other and would keep choosing each other, day after difficult day. The snow melted after 3 days, leaving the ground muddy but workable. Colt started clearing the site for Nora's cookhouse, pulling rocks and evening out the ground, while she sketched plans and made lists of supplies. They worked separately but together, each focused on their tasks, but always aware of the other's presence, always ready to help or share a thought, or just exist in comfortable silence. Vernon rode out near the end of the 4th week with news about the trial. Territorial judge is coming through in 6 weeks, he said, accepting the coffee Nora offered. Wants to hear the case against Boonhart, get it settled before winter makes travel impossible. Prosecution's asking if you'll testify, Nora. They say your account combined with Reed's would be unshakable. But they also said if you can't or won't, they'll understand and work with what they have. Nora glanced at Colt, who gave her the smallest nod. Your choice. Whatever you decide. She took a deep breath. I'll testify, she said. Not for them, not for justice, not even really for the other women he hurt. I'll testify for me. Because I want to look him in the eye and show him that I'm still here, still standing, still strong. That he didn't destroy me no matter how hard he tried. Vernon smiled with genuine respect. That's the bravest damn thing I've heard in a long time, ma'am. We'll make sure you're protected every step of the way. And Colt, he turned to the big man, I assume you'll be there? Try to stop me. Wouldn't dream of it. Truth be told, I sleep better knowing you're on the side of right these days. Town's getting used to having you around too. Heard Martha Hensley's been telling everyone about how polite and helpful you were when they visited. Coming from her, that's high praise. After Vernon left, Nora and Colt sat on the porch and watched the sun set. It had become their evening ritual, this quiet time before dinner when they'd decompress from the day and prepare for the night. Are you scared? Colt asked. About the trial. Terrified, Nora admitted, but also ready. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. The things worth doing are usually the things that scare us most. Is that from experience? That's from opening a door on a stormy night and finding you on the other side. Scariest thing I'd done in years. Best thing too. Nora leaned her head against his shoulder. Another first. Another small step toward trust and intimacy. Where else would you be? Exactly, Colt said, and they sat like that until the stars came out. 2 people who'd found each other in darkness and were learning, slowly but surely, how to live in the light. The 6 weeks before the trial passed in a strange suspension between anticipation and normalcy. Colt and Nora fell deeper into their routines, building something that looked remarkably like a life together. The foundation for the cookhouse went in during the 3rd week, limestone blocks that Colt hauled from the creek bed and set with mortar he mixed himself. Nora watched the structure take shape with an expression that moved between disbelief and joy, like she couldn't quite trust that something good was actually happening to her. It's real, Colt would remind her when he caught that look. You're allowed to have good things. I know, she'd reply. I'm just not used to them yet. They made another trip to Redemption Springs to order lumber and supplies, and this time the reception was noticeably warmer. People nodded greetings, shopkeepers asked after their well-being, and Martha Hensley insisted they stay for supper at her boarding house.
Over pot roast and potatoes, surrounded by other diners who treated them like neighbors rather than curiosities, Nora laughed at something one of the ranch hands said, and Colt realized he was watching her come back to life in real time. "You're staring," she said later as they drove the wagon home under a sky full of stars. "Am I?" "You know you are. What are you thinking about?" Colt considered lying, then decided against it. "I'm thinking about how different you look when you laugh. How the person you are now is starting to overshadow the person you were when you showed up on my porch. I'm thinking about how glad I am to be seeing it happen." Nora was quiet for a moment, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her shawl. "Can I tell you something? Something I've been afraid to say out loud?" "Always?" "I'm happy." She said it like a confession, like an admission of guilt. "I know I shouldn't be. Not with the trial coming up. Not with everything that happened still so fresh. But sitting in that boarding house tonight, being included in the conversation, having people treat me like I'm a person with a future instead of a victim with only a past, and then coming home to this, to you, to the cookhouse taking shape. I'm happy, Colt. And that terrifies me because I'm afraid if I acknowledge it, something will come along and take it away." "Nothing's taking anything away," Colt said firmly. "Not Boonhart, not the trial, not the past. You've earned this happiness, Nora. You've fought for it, bled for it, survived for it. And I'll be damned if I let anyone or anything steal it from you now." She reached over and laced her fingers through his, and they rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, both of them thinking about futures they'd stopped believing in and presents that felt too good to be true. The nightmares still came, though less frequently. Some nights Nora would wake gasping, her body rigid with phantom pain, and Colt would talk to her quietly until her breathing evened out. Other nights it was Colt who woke in a cold sweat, trapped in the moment of impact, feeling Brennan's skull give way under his fist. On those nights, Nora would reach out in the darkness and take his hand, grounding him in the present with her touch. "We're quite a pair," she said one night after they'd both been startled awake by their respective demons. "Two broken people trying to fix each other." "Maybe we're not trying to fix each other," Colt replied. "Maybe we're just holding each other together while we heal ourselves." "That's surprisingly philosophical for 3 a.m. "I have my moments." They were getting closer, growing more comfortable with proximity and touch, but both of them were careful about the line between comfort and something more. Neither wanted to rush into anything that might complicate the foundation they were building. There would be time for those conversations later, after the trial, after Nora had fully reclaimed her sense of safety. For now, it was enough to share space and trust in the quiet knowledge that whatever was growing between them was worth protecting. The cookhouse walls went up in the 5th week, rough-cut lumber that smelled of pine and promise. Colt had enlisted help from some of the men he'd met in town, ranch hands between jobs who were happy to trade labor for meals and a few dollars. They worked efficiently, joking with each other and treating Nora with easy respect that said volumes about how much the town's opinion had shifted. She fed them lunch each day, testing recipes and taking mental notes about what worked and what needed adjustment. And by the end of the week, the men were calling her Miss Nora with genuine affection and asking when the cookhouse would officially open. "Spring, maybe," she told them, "after the trial, after things settle. But when I do open, you boys will be the first to know." "You better believe we'll be here," one of them said, a young cowboy named Billy, who couldn't have been more than 20. "Best biscuits I've had since my mama died, Miss Nora. You're going to make a fortune once word gets out." After they left each day, Nora and Colt would walk through the structure, imagining how it would look when finished, where the stove would go, where the tables would sit, how the light would come through the windows in the morning. It was an act of faith, this building, a declaration that the future was real and worth investing in. "I want to paint the door red," Nora said one evening, running her hand along the frame. "My mother always said a red door meant welcome, meant this was a place where you'd be fed body and soul. I want people to see it from the road and know they'll be taken care of here." "Then we'll paint it red," Colt said. "Brightest red we can find." The letter from the prosecutor's office arrived 10 days before the trial. It outlined what Nora would need to testify about, who else would be present, how the process would work. Reading it, seeing her trauma reduced to legal language and case numbers, brought back some of the fear she'd been working so hard to overcome. Her hand shook as she folded the letter and set it aside. "I don't know if I can do this," she said. "Sit there and describe everything in front of strangers while Boonhart stares at me. What if I freeze? What if I can't get the words out?" "Then we'll ask for a recess, and you'll take the time you need," Colt said. "And if you get through even one sentence before you have to stop, that's one more sentence than Boonhart wanted you to say. Every word you speak is a victory, Nora. Don't let the fear of not being perfect stop you from being brave." She nodded, but he could see the anxiety eating at her. Over the next few days, she became quieter, more withdrawn, jumping at sudden sounds and avoiding his eyes when he tried to check in with her. It was like watching her slip backward into the frightened woman who'd collapsed on his porch, and Colt felt helpless to stop it. On the third night of this regression, he found her sitting outside the cookhouse after dark, wrapped in a blanket and staring at nothing. He sat beside her without speaking, just present, waiting for her to find whatever words she needed. "What if I'm not strong enough?" she finally said. "What if I get up there and fall apart, and Boonhart's lawyer uses it to prove I'm unstable? What if my testimony is what sets him free? Then we'll know you tried your best, and that's all anyone can ask. But Nora, I've watched you survive things that would have destroyed most people. I've watched you rebuild yourself from nothing but determination and hope. You're stronger than you think you are, and you're definitely stronger than anything Boonhart can throw at you. How can you be so sure?" "Because I've seen you at your lowest, and even then, you had enough strength left to knock on a stranger's door and ask for help. That takes courage most people never have to find. The trial is just another door, Nora, and on the other side of it is your freedom. Real, complete freedom. Not just from Boonhart, but from the power he still has over you in your mind. You knock on that door, you walk through it, and you never have to be afraid of him again." She leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "What if I need you there? In the courtroom, I mean, physically there, where I can see you. Then I'll be there, front row, where you can't miss me. And any time you need to look away from him, you look at me instead. I'll be your anchor." "Where else would you be?" she whispered. "Exactly." The morning they left for the trial arrived cold and gray, the kind of day that felt like a held breath. They'd packed the wagon the night before, Nora's testimony papers, a change of clothes, provisions for the 2-day journey to the county seat where the trial would be held. Vernon was meeting them there with Reed and the other witnesses. The prosecutor, a man named Harrison Cole, had written to say he was confident in their case but wanted to prepare Nora thoroughly before she took the stand. The trip was tense. Nora barely spoke, lost in her own thoughts and fears. Colt tried to give her space while also staying close enough that she knew he was there if she needed him. They stopped for the night at a way station, taking separate rooms despite the knowing looks from the proprietor, and Colt lay awake listening for sounds of distress from Nora's room. He heard her pacing for hours before finally settling, and he wondered if she'd slept at all. The courthouse was an imposing brick building in a town called Lewiston, larger than Redemption Springs but with the same frontier roughness around its edges. They arrived mid-morning of the first day, and Vernon met them on the steps with Cole, a sharp-eyed man in his 40s who wore wire-rimmed spectacles and carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd won more cases than he'd lost. "Miss Hale," he said, shaking Nora's hand, "thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy, but your testimony is crucial to putting Boonhart away for a very long time. Shall we go inside and discuss strategy?" They spent the next 3 hours in a side room while Cole walked Nora through what would happen. He asked her to tell her story multiple times, pushing her on details, playing devil's advocate in ways that made Colt's fists clench. But it was necessary. Cole needed to know how she'd hold up under cross-examination, needed to prepare her for the kinds of attacks Boonhart's lawyer would make on her credibility. "He's going to try to paint you as a willing participant who changed her mind later," Cole said bluntly. "He'll ask about your past, your relationships, anything he can use to suggest you're not a reliable narrator of your own experience. I need you to stay calm, stick to the facts, and remember that the truth is on your side. Can you do that?" "I can try," Nora said, her voice small but determined. "That's all I ask." The trial began the next morning in a courtroom packed with spectators. News of the case had spread. Brutal wagon master accused of rape and murder,
honest settler woman fighting back against her abuser, and people had come from miles around to watch justice be served or denied. Colt sat in the front row as promised, his size and scars making the people next to him noticeably uncomfortable,
but he didn't care. He was here for Nora, and everyone else could think whatever they wanted. When they brought Boonhart in, Colt felt rage coil in his gut like a living thing. The wagon master looked thinner than he had in Redemption Springs, his time in territorial prison clearly taking a toll, but his eyes still held that same cruel intelligence. And when his gaze found Nora, sitting at the prosecutor's table, something predatory flickered across his face before his lawyer leaned over and whispered something that made him school his expression to false remorse. The first day was procedural: jury selection, opening statements, the prosecutor laying out the timeline of events. Cole was good, painting a picture of systematic abuse and calculated cruelty that had the jury shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Boonhart's lawyer, a snake oil salesman type named Aldrich Finn, countered with a narrative about misunderstandings and a woman scorned, about a respectable businessman being destroyed by false accusations. It made Colt want to climb over the rail and finish what he'd started in Redemption Springs, but he kept himself still through sheer force of will. Thomas Reed testified on the second day, and his account was devastating. He described in clinical detail the things he'd witnessed, the women who'd been used and discarded, the mounting violence that had become normalized in Boonhart's crew. He explained how Pike had tried to leave, how Boonhart had shot him in cold blood, how they'd planted the body to frame Colt. Reed's voice broke multiple times, and by the end of his testimony, half the jury looked ready to convict Boonhart on the spot. But then Finn stood up for cross-examination, and Colt saw how the game was really played. Finn tore into Reed's credibility, pointing out that he'd participated in the abuse, that he was testifying in exchange for leniency, that he had every reason to lie to save his own skin. By the time Finn was done, Reed looked like a broken man, and the certainty Colt had seen in the jury's faces had wavered into doubt. "This is how they win," Cole said quietly during recess. "They don't prove innocence. They just muddy the water enough that reasonable doubt creeps in. That's why your testimony is so important, Nora. You're the only one with nothing to gain from lying." Nora took the stand on the third day, and Colt watched her walk to the witness box like she was walking to her own execution. She wore a simple blue dress Martha Hensley had given her, and she'd pulled her hair back in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she was. Smart, Colt thought. Let the jury see what Boonhart did to someone who couldn't fight back. Cole started gently, establishing Nora's background, her work history, how she'd come to join Boonhart's crew. Then he asked her to describe what had happened, and Nora took a shaky breath and began to speak. She told them everything. About the lies Boonhart had used to recruit her, about the families who'd disappeared one by one, about the first time one of the men had touched her without permission and Boonhart had laughed it off, about the escalating abuse, the threats, the other women who'd tried to escape and failed, about the night Boonhart had beaten her and the desperate flight that had brought her to Colt's door. Her voice broke multiple times. She had to stop and compose herself, had to accept water from the bailiff and time to breathe. But she kept going, kept pushing through the pain and humiliation of having to describe the worst moments of her life to a room full of strangers. And through it all, whenever she felt herself faltering, she'd look at Colt, and he'd give her the smallest nod, and she'd find the strength to continue. When Cole finished, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of several women in the gallery crying. Even some of the men looked shaken, their faces tight with barely suppressed anger. The jury was leaning forward, fully invested in Nora's story, and Colt dared to hope that maybe, finally, justice would actually be served. Then Aldrich Finn stood up, straightened his vest, and smiled like a shark. "Miss Hale," he began, his tone dripping with false sympathy, "that was quite a harrowing tale. I'm sure everyone here feels terrible about your ordeal, but I have to ask, and please understand, this is my job, did you at any point tell Mr. Boonhart or any of his men that you didn't consent to their advances?" Nora blinked. "I fought them. I pushed them away. I said no. But did you explicitly say the words, 'I do not consent,' or 'I want you to stop'? Because, you see, there's often confusion in these situations. A man might interpret reluctance as modesty, especially with a woman of your background." My background? Nora's voice went cold. You've worked in various establishments, haven't you? Boarding houses, saloons, wagon crews, places where the lines between appropriate and inappropriate conduct can sometimes blur. Is it possible you sent mixed signals? That Mr. Boonhart genuinely believed you were amenable to his attentions? Cole was on his feet. Objection. Counsel is attacking the witness's character without foundation. I'm establishing context, Your Honor, Finn replied smoothly. The judge, an elderly man who'd looked sympathetic during Nora's testimony, now looked uncertain. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Mr. Finn. Finn turned back to Nora with renewed confidence. Let's talk about the night you claim Mr. Boonhart beat you. You said this happened because you rejected his advances. But isn't it true that there was money missing from his lockbox? Isn't it possible he confronted you about theft, and the altercation stemmed from that rather than any improper behavior on his part? That's a lie, Nora said, her voice rising. I never stole anything. He beat me because I fought back against him trying to… She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Trying to what, Miss Hale? Collect a debt? Enforce the terms of your employment contract? Finn produced the forged contract and waved it at the jury. This document clearly states you agreed to provide services to Mr. Boonhart's crew in exchange for passage west. Is it not possible you simply misunderstood the nature of those services? No, Nora said, but Colt could hear the doubt creeping into her voice, the old familiar shame that abusers planted in their victims. No, I knew what cooking meant. I knew what… Did you? Finn pressed. Because from where I stand, it looks like you agreed to something, decided later you didn't like it, and then ran to the nearest large man you could find to protect you from the consequences of your own choices. And when that man, this Mr. Mercer, turned out to be a known killer with a history of violence, suddenly you had the perfect weapon to use against my client. Isn't that the real story here, Miss Hale? Objection! Cole was on his feet again. Your Honor, this is pure speculation and character assassination. Sustained, the judge said, but the damage was done. Colt could see it in the jury's faces, the doubt that Finn had carefully cultivated, the suggestion that maybe Nora wasn't the innocent victim she'd claimed to be. Nora saw it too. Her composure cracked, and tears started streaming down her face. I'm telling the truth, she said desperately. Everything I said happened exactly the way I said it did. He hurt me. He hurt other women. He's a monster, and he needs to… No further questions, Finn said, cutting her off and returning to his seat with a satisfied smile. Cole did his best to rehabilitate Nora's testimony on redirect, but the spell was broken. By the time she stepped down from the witness box, she looked defeated, and Colt wanted to tear Finn apart with his bare hands for what he'd done to her. They recessed for the day, and Colt found Nora in the side room where witnesses waited, curled in a chair with her arms wrapped around herself. He sat beside her and pulled her into his arms, and she cried against his chest like her heart was breaking. I failed, she sobbed. I let him twist everything. I let him make it sound like it was my fault. You didn't fail, Colt said fiercely. You told the truth, and that bastard lawyer did what bastard lawyers do. But Nora, the jury heard you. They saw your pain. They know what really happened, even if Finn tried to muddy it. How can you be sure? Because I was watching them, and I saw their faces when you described what Boonhart did to you. They believed you then, and they'll remember that when they deliberate. You did everything right. Cole joined them a few minutes later, looking grim, but not defeated. That was rough, but not unexpected. Finn's good at creating doubt, but he didn't actually disprove anything you said. And tomorrow, we have our rebuttal witnesses, the doctor who examined your injuries, the marshal who investigated the crime scene, character witnesses who will testify about Boonhart's reputation. We're not done yet. The fourth day brought those rebuttal witnesses, each one chipping away at the defense's narrative. The doctor confirmed that Nora's injuries were consistent with a severe beating and sexual assault. Vernon testified about the bloodstains in Boonhart's camp and the women's clothing found in the tents. Martha Hensley and others from Redemption Springs spoke about Nora's character, describing her as honest and hardworking and clearly traumatized when she'd first come to town. Finn tried to counter, but his questions grew increasingly desperate. By the time closing arguments came around, Colt felt cautiously optimistic again. Cole's closing was passionate and precise, hitting every point that mattered.
Ezekiel Boonhart is a predator who used his position of power to abuse vulnerable women. He counted on their silence, on their shame, on a world that too often believes men like him over women like Miss Hale. But she found her voice. She found her courage. And she came here to tell you the truth, despite knowing she'd be attacked and doubted and made to feel like the criminal instead of the victim. The question before you isn't whether Miss Hale is perfect. None of us are. The question is whether you believe her. And if you do, then you have a duty to hold Ezekiel Boonhart accountable for his crimes. Finn's closing tried to resurrect the doubt he'd planted, painting Boonhart as a misunderstood businessman and Nora as a confused woman with ulterior motives. But it felt hollow after everything they'd heard, and Colt could see the jury wasn't buying it. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. 6 hours during which Colt and Nora sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, holding hands and barely speaking, while their entire future hung in the balance. Vernon paced. Cole reviewed his notes compulsively. Other spectators wandered in and out, speculating about the verdict, making Colt want to throw them all out the nearest window. Finally, the bailiff emerged. Juries reached a verdict. They filed back into the courtroom, and Colt watched Boonhart's face as the foreman stood. The wagon master was trying to look confident, but Colt saw fear in his eyes, the same fear Nora must have felt every day in his camp. On the charge of murder in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of assault with intent to cause bodily harm? Guilty. On the charges of rape and sexual assault? Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others gasped, and Nora collapsed against Colt's shoulder with a sob that sounded like relief and grief and triumph all mixed together. Boonhart's face went white, then red, and he lunged toward the prosecutor's table before the bailiffs grabbed him. "You lying whore!" he screamed at Nora. "I'll kill you! I'll hunt you down and—" The bailiffs dragged him out, still screaming threats, and the judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. When the room finally quieted, he looked at Nora with something like kindness. "Miss Hale, I want you to know that this court believes you and stands with you. Mr. Boonhart will be sentenced to death by hanging for his crimes, to be carried out within 60 days. I hope that brings you some measure of peace." Nora nodded, unable to speak, and Colt just held her while the courtroom slowly emptied around them. They stayed in Lewiston that night, too exhausted and emotionally wrung out to face the journey home. In separate rooms again, though Colt suspected they were both lying awake, processing everything that had happened, they tried to rest and failed. Around midnight, Colt heard a soft knock on his door. When he opened it, Nora stood there in her nightgown and robe, her face streaked with tears. "Can I stay here?" she asked. I just don't want to be alone right now." "Of course." She came in and curled up on one side of the bed while Colt lay on the other, carefully maintaining space between them. But after a few minutes, Nora rolled over and pressed herself against his side, her head on his chest, and Colt wrapped his arm around her and held her while she cried herself to sleep. Tomorrow they'd go home. Tomorrow they'd rebuild and move forward and figure out what their lives looked like now that the shadow of Boonhart was finally gone. But tonight, they just held each other and let themselves feel everything: the pain, the relief, the exhaustion, the hope. The journey back to the ranch took 3 days because they weren't in any hurry. They stopped at scenic overlooks, shared meals by the roadside, talked about everything except the trial. About books they'd read, places they wanted to see someday, whether the cookhouse should have windows on the east or west wall to catch the best light. Normal conversations about a normal life they were building together. When the ranch finally came into view, Nora let out a long breath. "Home," she said wonderingly. "It actually feels like home now." "It is home," Colt confirmed, "for both of us." They spent the next few weeks finishing the cookhouse. The roof went on, the stove was installed, the tables and chairs were built and arranged. Nora painted the door herself, a brilliant red that could be seen from the road, exactly as she'd wanted. And on a bright November morning with snow threatening on the horizon, she officially opened for business. The response was better than either of them had dared hope. Ranch hands came from miles around, drawn by word of mouth about Miss Nora's cooking. Travelers stopped on their way west, grateful for a hot meal and a friendly face. Even some of the townspeople from Redemption Springs made the journey, Martha Hensley among them, to support Nora's dream. "You did it," Colt said one evening as they closed up after a particularly busy day. You built exactly what you wanted. We did it, Nora corrected. I couldn't have done any of this without you. They stood in the cookhouse with its red door and its warm stove and its tables that had seen laughter and conversation and community, and Colt realized this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of something good that grew up around it and through it, until the pain was just one part of a much larger story. Winter came in earnest, and the cookhouse closed for the season as the roads became impassable. But Colt and Nora didn't mind. It gave them time to rest, to plan for spring, to simply exist together without the weight of survival pressing on them. They moved into the main house together, sharing space more openly now that the immediate crisis had passed. The nightmares still came occasionally, but less frequently, and when they did, they knew how to navigate them together. They learned each other's rhythms and quirks, figured out how to fight fair and apologize sincerely, built the kind of partnership that came from choosing each other every day, even when it wasn't easy. One evening in late December, sitting by the fire while snow fell outside, Nora said, I've been thinking about something. What's that? About us. About what we are to each other. She turned to look at him, her face serious. When I first came here, I needed you to save me. And you did. But I don't need that anymore. I'm strong enough now to save myself if I had to. And yet I still want you here. Still want this, whatever this is. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Colt said. Because I don't need you to fix me either. I'm doing that work myself. But I want you here while I do it. Want to build something with you that's not about survival or healing or making up for the past. Just about two people who like each other choosing to be together.
So what do we call that?
Colt smiled.
How about love? Nora's breath caught. Love?
If you want. No pressure, no expectations, just the truth. I love you, Nora Hale. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you make everything better just by being part of it. I love the life we're building and the person I'm becoming because you're in it. And I'll love you whether you say it back or not, because that's just how it is. Tears were streaming down Nora's face, but she was smiling. I love you too, Colt Mercer. I love your gentleness and your patience and the way you make me feel safe without making me feel small. I love that you see me as strong even when I feel weak. I love this life we're building, and I want to keep building it for as long as you'll have me. How about forever? Colt asked. Forever works. They kissed then, really kissed, for the first time since Nora had arrived half dead on his porch all those months ago. It was tender and careful and full of promise, the kiss of two people who knew exactly what they had and weren't taking any of it for granted. Spring came, and with it new beginnings. The cookhouse reopened to even bigger crowds. Nora hired help, a young woman named Sarah who'd answered an advertisement and who Nora promised would be treated with respect and paid fairly. Word spread about the cookhouse with the red door where the food was excellent and the owner had overcome hell itself to build something beautiful. Colt proposed properly in April, with a ring he'd commissioned from a jeweler in Lewiston and a speech he'd practiced for weeks and still fumbled through nervously. Nora said yes before he'd even finished asking, and they were married in May by a traveling preacher with half the territory in attendance. Marshall Vernon gave Nora away. Martha Hensley wept openly,